The morning fog rolled across Fort Bragg like a living thing, thick and gray, swallowing the pine trees that lined the perimeter of the most elite training facility in the United States military. Master Sergeant Thomas Briggs stood at the edge of the range, his weathered hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. At 62 years old, he had seen more sunrises than most men would see in two lifetimes. Vietnam, Grenada, the First Gulf War, Somalia, Afghanistan, Iraq. The names rolled through his memory like a rosary of violence and sacrifice. But this morning felt different. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change, something significant, something that would remind him why he still wore the uniform after all these years. The young men and women gathering behind him on the range represented the best of the best. 25 sharpshooters pulled from Delta Force, SEAL teams, Marine Scout snipers, Army Rangers, each one capable of putting a bullet through a man's eye at 1,000 yards. Each one cocky enough to believe they had already mastered everything there was to know about pulling a trigger. Briggs knew better. He had learned in the jungles of Southeast Asia that true mastery wasn't about the shot you could make. It was about understanding the shot you couldn't, the limits, the boundaries, the point where physics and human capability intersected with brutal reality. Today, he would teach them about humility. Captain Marcus Kane arrived last, as always, making an entrance even when he didn't intend to. 29 years old with movie star features and the kind of natural confidence that came from growing up as the son of Senator William Kane. The young captain had earned his place here through genuine skill. Briggs had to admit that much. 370 confirmed kills in Afghanistan and Syria, a record that would have made him a legend in any other generation. But Kane carried himself like he was already writing his own mythology, and that kind of arrogance got men killed. "Good morning, Sergeant," Kane said, his voice carrying across the range with the casual authority of someone who had never truly failed at anything in his life. Briggs nodded, saying nothing. He had learned long ago that silence was often the best response to men like Kane. Let them fill the quiet with their own assumptions. Let them think they understood what the old man was thinking. The rest of the shooters assembled in loose formation, their breath visible in the cold November air. Among them, Briggs recognized faces he had trained over the years. Staff Sergeant Jake Reynolds, a solid operator with a haunted look that never quite left his eyes. Lieutenant Amy Chen, brilliant and analytical, the kind of mind that could calculate wind drift and Coriolis effect in her head faster than most men could work a ballistic computer. Sergeant First Class Maria Santos, quiet and observant, with instincts that bordered on precognition. "All right, gather in," Briggs called out, his voice rough from decades of cigarettes he'd finally quit 5 years too late. His southern accent, softened by time but never quite erased, gave his words a musical quality that younger soldiers sometimes mistook for gentleness. They learned quickly that Thomas Briggs was anything but gentle. Today we're going to talk about something most of you think you've already mastered. The impossible shot. The one that separates the men who get medals from the men who get body bags sent home to their families. A few of the younger shooters exchanged glances. Kane smiled slightly, like a professor's star pupil waiting for the lecture to catch up to what he already knew. Briggs gestured toward the far end of the range, where a target sat barely visible through the morning haze. 1,760 yards. Just over a mile. The distance that had once seemed impossible until Carlos Hathcock made it possible in Vietnam. The old gunny sergeant had taken that shot with iron sights and a scope meant for spotting, not shooting. One bullet, one kill, one moment that changed everything. "This is what we call the impossible mile," Briggs continued. He pulled a weathered rifle from its case, a vintage M40 that looked like it belonged in a museum rather than on an active firing range. No modern optics, no laser rangefinders, no computer-assisted ballistic calculators, just iron sights and 60 years of accumulated knowledge about how to make metal fly true across impossible distances. The conditions today are about as bad as they get without calling off the exercise entirely. Wind gusting between 15 and 30 miles per hour from the northwest. Temperature 42 degrees Fahrenheit and dropping. Humidity at 87%. Barometric pressure falling. Every single variable working against you. Kane stepped forward, confident as ever. "With respect, Sergeant, that's why we have technology. Modern scopes can compensate for most of those variables. We're not living in the Vietnam era anymore." Briggs looked at the young captain for a long moment. "Is that right, son?" The older man's tone held no heat, no challenge, just a quiet curiosity that somehow felt more dangerous than anger. Technology is a tool, Kane continued, seemingly oblivious to the shift in atmosphere. A damn good one. I could make that shot right now with the right equipment. Hell, half the people here could. Briggs nodded slowly. All right then, show me. The invitation hung in the air like a challenge, which of course it was. Kane's confidence never wavered. He stepped to the firing line, accepting a state-of-the-art rifle from one of the range assistants. The weapon represented the pinnacle of modern sniper technology. Schmidt and Bender scope. Precision machined barrel. Stock adjusted to Kane's exact specifications. A weapon that cost more than most Americans made in 6 months. The young captain settled into position with practiced ease. His form was textbook perfect. Breathing controlled. Trigger finger placement exact. Eye relief optimal. He ran through his calculations with the help of a small ballistic computer mounted to the scope, inputting wind speed, temperature, altitude, even the rotation of the Earth. Briggs watched in silence. The other shooters gathered closer, sensing that something important was happening, even if they couldn't quite articulate what. Kane's finger tightened on the trigger. The rifle cracked, the sound rolling across the range and echoing off the distant tree line. Through his spotting scope, Briggs watched the bullet's impact. 8 feet low and 3 feet left, a miss that would have been catastrophic in combat. The young captain's face registered surprise, then confusion, then the beginning of frustration. He ran the numbers again, adjusted his scope, and fired a second time. 6 feet high and 2 feet right. Worse than before. The physics don't lie, Briggs said quietly. You're fighting variables your computer can't see. The thermal layers in the air. The way wind curls around terrain features. The subtle difference between the temperature at the firing line and the temperature where that bullet's going to be 2.5 seconds from now. Kane stood up from the rifle, his jaw tight. Then it's an impossible shot, Sergeant. Just like you said, nobody could make it consistently under these conditions. Nobody living anyway, a voice added from the back of the formation. The comment drew scattered laughter. Briggs felt something shift in the air behind him. He turned slowly and saw a figure standing at the entrance to the range. The morning sun, just beginning to burn through the fog, backlit the newcomer in a way that made details hard to discern. Average height, civilian clothes, jeans, and a flannel shirt that had seen better days. Gray-streaked hair pulled back in a simple ponytail. The figure walked forward with an economy of movement that spoke of decades of muscle memory. No wasted motion, no uncertainty, just purposeful steps that covered ground efficiently. As the distance closed, Briggs felt his heart skip. It had been 5 years. 5 years since he'd seen that face. 5 years since he'd watched her walk away from everything she'd built, everything she'd sacrificed for. 5 years of wondering if she'd ever come back. Sarah, he whispered, the name barely audible even to himself. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah McKenzie stopped about 10 feet from the assembled shooters. She looked older than Briggs remembered. The lines around her eyes had deepened. The scar along her left jaw, legacy of a Taliban knife in Kandahar, seemed more prominent against her weathered skin. But the eyes were the same, gray-green like the winter ocean, and just as cold when she wanted them to be. Master Sergeant Briggs, she said formally, her voice carrying none of the warmth that had once existed between them. I'm reporting as ordered. The confusion among the shooters was palpable. Kane stepped forward, his earlier frustration transforming into professional curiosity mixed with suspicion. Ordered by whom? Colonel Hayes didn't mention any additional personnel joining this training rotation. Sarah's eyes shifted to Kane, assessing him in the way a surgeon might examine a particularly interesting pathology. The Presidential Special Operations Division. I'm here as a senior advisor. My credentials were forwarded to Colonel Hayes' office yesterday. She pulled a folder from her jacket and handed it to Briggs. He didn't need to open it to know what was inside. Transfer orders that would be maddeningly vague. A service record that would be mostly redacted. Commendations that couldn't be discussed. The paper trail of a ghost. Kane wasn't satisfied. A senior advisor for what exactly? We're running advanced marksmanship training here, not some special project. Sarah turned her full attention to the young captain, and Briggs saw him involuntarily straighten under her gaze. For someone who looked like she could be mistaken for a librarian or a high school teacher, Sarah McKenzie had a presence that commanded respect from men who didn't respect much. I'm here to observe and assess, she said simply. Nothing more. The dismissal in her tone was clear. Kane's jaw tightened again, but he was smart enough to recognize when he was being warned off. He stepped back, exchanging glances with some of the other shooters. Briggs cleared his throat, trying to regain control of his training session. All right, back to work. We've established that modern technology alone isn't enough to make the impossible mile. Now let's talk about why. But Sarah was already moving toward the firing line. Without asking permission, without fanfare, she picked up the vintage M40 that Briggs had brought out earlier. She checked the chamber with practiced efficiency, ran her hand along the barrel to check for any defects, tested the trigger pull. Ma'am, one of the younger shooters said uncertainly, that rifle isn't zeroed. Nobody's used it in probably 20 years. Sarah ignored the comment. She settled into position behind the rifle, and Briggs felt something shift in his chest. He'd seen Sarah shoot 1,000 times during their years working together, had watched her make shots that defied belief, had stood beside her in places where the wrong calculation meant death for everyone in the unit. But he'd never seen her look quite like this. There was something different in her eyes, something harder, something that looked a lot like controlled rage. The young captain, Kane, couldn't help himself. Ma'am, with all due respect, if you're trying to make a point about old school versus new school, I already demonstrated that this shot is beyond current capability even with modern equipment. Using iron sights is just going to prove it's impossible. Sarah's finger moved to the trigger. She hadn't said a word, hadn't run any calculations, hadn't checked wind speed or temperature, or any of the variables that Kane had so carefully inputted into his ballistic computer. She simply breathed, slow and steady, and Briggs recognized the rhythm. In for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, out for 4 counts. The same breathing pattern he'd taught her 20 years ago when she was a young lieutenant who thought she knew everything. The rifle cracked once, the sound sharp and final. Silence fell across the range like a curtain. Every shooter knew that sound, the particular acoustic signature of a bullet leaving a barrel at supersonic speeds. But what came next was the part that separated the competent from the legendary. 2.5 seconds of absolute quiet, the bullet arcing across 1,760 yards, fighting gravity, fighting wind, fighting every law of physics that said this shouldn't work. And then, through Briggs's spotting scope, he saw it. The target, barely visible through the morning haze, erupted in a small cloud of paper and backing material. Dead center. Perfect. The silence deepened, transformed from anticipation to something closer to shock. Briggs felt his hands start to shake slightly, a tremor he hadn't experienced since his last firefight in Fallujah. He knew what this meant, knew what Sarah had just done, knew that nothing at Fort Bragg would be the same after this moment. That's impossible, someone whispered. The comment seemed to break the spell. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once, voices overlapping in confusion and disbelief. Lucky shot, Kane said, but his voice lacked conviction. Nobody gets that lucky. Sarah stood up from the rifle, her movements unhurried. She turned to face the assembled shooters, and for the first time, Briggs saw something flicker across her face. Not pride, not satisfaction. Something closer to exhaustion, like a runner who'd just crossed a finish line they'd been running toward for years. It wasn't luck, she said quietly. Her voice cut through the chatter like a blade. It was calculation, math, physics, understanding that your computer can't see thermal inversions, can't predict how wind behaves when it hits a ridgeline 3/4 of a mile downrange, can't account for the way morning dew affects air density at ground level. She paused, letting her words settle over the crowd. Carlos Hathcock made this shot in 1967 with equipment that would be considered primitive by today's standards. Not because he was lucky, because he understood something that most of you have forgotten in your rush to trust technology over experience. He understood that every shot is unique. Every moment has variables that no computer can predict. You either learn to see those variables or you die wondering why your calculations were wrong. Kane found his voice again, though it came out slightly defensive. With all due respect, ma'am, who exactly are you? Before Sarah could answer, the sound of a vehicle approaching made everyone turn. A black SUV with government plates pulled up to the range entrance. The door opened and Colonel Victor Hayes stepped out, his face flushed with what looked like a combination of surprise and irritation. At ease, he called out, though nobody had actually come to attention. He walked toward the group with quick, purposeful strides. His eyes locked on Sarah, and Briggs saw recognition flash across the colonel's features, followed immediately by something that looked like alarm. "Lieutenant Colonel McKenzie," Hayes said, his voice tight, "your presence here wasn't on this morning's briefing schedule." Sarah turned to face him, and Briggs was struck again by how much older she looked, not just in years, but in the weight she seemed to carry, like someone who'd been asked to hold up too much for too long. "My apologies, Colonel. The transfer came through faster than anticipated. I intended to report to your office first, but I heard there was a training exercise in progress and thought I'd observe." Hayes's jaw worked silently for a moment. "Then I think we need to have a conversation. In my office. Now." Sarah nodded once, a small gesture of acknowledgement. She looked back at Briggs, and for just a moment her eyes softened. Something passed between them, unspoken, heavy with history and regret. "It's good to see you, Tom," she said quietly, using his first name for the first time since arriving. Before Briggs could respond, she turned and walked toward the SUV with Hayes. The colonel was already on his radio, speaking in low, urgent tones that didn't carry across the range. The shooter stood in stunned silence, watching the vehicle disappear toward the main administrative complex. Finally, Kane spoke up, his voice careful and controlled. "Sergeant Briggs, who the hell was that?" Briggs set down his spotting scope. His hands were still shaking, just slightly, a tremor that came from seeing ghosts made flesh. He'd kept Sarah's secret for 5 years, had told himself it was for her own good, for her safety, for reasons that seemed less convincing with each passing day. But now she was back, and all those carefully constructed justifications felt as substantial as morning fog burning away under the sun. "That," he said slowly, "was Lieutenant Colonel Sarah McKenzie. Some of you might know her by another name, the one they used in classified briefings. The one that showed up in after-action reports that got buried so deep you needed presidential clearance just to know they existed." He paused, letting the weight of what he was about to say settle on his shoulders. "You all know the legend of the widow, the sniper who never missed, the ghost who saved entire units without anyone knowing she was there, the shooter who made 300 confirmed kills across 4 different wars and never once failed a mission." Briggs looked at each of their faces in turn, seeing comprehension dawn like a slow sunrise. That was her. That's always been her. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah McKenzie, the widow. And if she's back here after 5 years of retirement, something's about to happen. Something big enough to bring a ghost back from the dead. The implications of that statement hung in the air like a question nobody wanted to ask. Maria Santos was the first to break the silence, her voice thoughtful and careful. "She looked angry, Sergeant. When she took that shot, I mean, like she was proving a point to someone who wasn't even here." Briggs nodded slowly. "Sarah McKenzie did everything for a reason. Every shot, every word, every decision calculated with the same precision she brought to the trigger. If she looked angry, it was because she was. The question was, angry at whom? And why now?" Jake Reynolds stepped forward, and Briggs noticed the way the staff sergeant's hands clenched and unclenched nervously. There was something in Reynolds' eyes, something that looked like recognition mixed with dread. "Sergeant," Reynolds said, his voice barely above a whisper, "does Colonel McKenzie's return have anything to do with Operation Pale Horse?" The question landed like a grenade in the middle of the formation. Several of the shooters shifted uncomfortably. Kane's eyes narrowed with sudden interest. Briggs felt his stomach drop. "Where did you hear that name, son?" Reynolds swallowed hard. "I was there, Sergeant, 7 years ago. Afghanistan. I was part of the unit." The admission seemed to cost him something. His face had gone pale, and Briggs could see the beginning of a tremor in the man's hands that had nothing to do with cold or age. "Then you know that's not something we discuss," Briggs said firmly, putting command weight behind his words. "Not here. Not now. Not ever." But the damage was done. Kane, with the instincts of a politician's son, had latched onto something potentially scandalous. His eyes moved between Reynolds and Briggs with calculating interest. "What's Operation Pale Horse? I've never heard of it in any briefing." "That's because it's classified above your pay grade," Captain Briggs snapped. "And it's going to stay that way." He turned back to the full formation, reasserting control through sheer force of will. "All right, training exercise is over for today. Return your weapons to the armory. Dismissed." The shooters began to disperse, some moving quickly as if eager to escape the suddenly tense atmosphere, others lingering to whisper among themselves. Kane hesitated, clearly wanting to push for more information, but even his considerable arrogance had limits. He eventually turned and walked away with stiff, controlled movements. Only Reynolds remained, standing motionless as the others filed past him. When the last shooter had moved out of earshot, he looked at Briggs with haunted eyes. "She's here because of Captain McKenzie, isn't she?" The staff sergeant's voice cracked slightly on the name. "Because of what happened to her son." Briggs didn't answer immediately. He began packing up the vintage M40, moving with the careful deliberation of a man trying to control his own emotions through physical action. "David McKenzie died 7 years ago in Afghanistan," Briggs finally said. "Killed in action during a classified operation." His mother received the folded flag and the condolence letter from the president. She buried her only child at Arlington National Cemetery on a Tuesday morning in October, while it rained hard enough to make the honor guard look like they were crying along with her. And then she retired from the military and disappeared for 5 years. He closed the rifle case with more force than necessary. "So yes, Jake, I imagine her being here has everything to do with her son, but I don't know why, and I don't know what she's planning. All I know is that Sarah McKenzie doesn't do anything without a damn good reason." Reynolds nodded slowly, looking like he might be sick. "Should I be worried, Sergeant?" Briggs met the younger man's eyes. "That depends, son. Did you do something 7 years ago that would give you a reason to be worried?" The question hung between them. Reynolds opened his mouth as if to answer, then seemed to think better of it. He turned and walked away, shoulders hunched like a man carrying a weight that kept getting heavier. Briggs stood alone on the firing range, watching the fog continue to burn away under the strengthening sun. Somewhere in the distance, a crow called out, its harsh cry echoing across the empty space. The sound made him think of funerals and unfinished business. Sarah McKenzie had come back for a reason. After 5 years of silence, after burying her son and walking away from everything she'd built, she'd come back to Fort Bragg and made a shot that announced her presence in the most dramatic way possible. Not to show off, not to prove anything to the young shooters who didn't know her legend. She'd made that shot as a declaration. A line drawn in the sand, a statement that said, "I'm here, and I remember everything." The question was, who was that message really for? Briggs pulled out his phone and stared at it for a long moment. He had Sarah's number, had kept it all these years, even though she'd never once answered his calls or responded to his messages. But maybe now, maybe after this morning, she might actually pick up. His finger hovered over the call button, then stopped. No. If Sarah wanted to talk to him, she knew where to find him. Pushing her would only make her dig in deeper, and a dug in Sarah McKenzie was about as movable as a mountain. Instead, he opened a different contact, a number he'd been told to call only in emergency situations, a direct line to someone who supposedly didn't exist in any official capacity. The phone rang 3 times before a woman's voice answered. "Secure line 7, authentication required." Briggs gave his code, a string of numbers and letters he'd memorized years ago. There was a brief pause, then a click as the encryption engaged. "This is Briggs. We have a situation at Fort Bragg. The widow is back." Another pause, longer this time. When the voice came back, it had lost its professional detachment. "We know." She went off script. "The transfer was supposed to be quiet, low profile. We didn't authorize any demonstrations." Briggs felt anger flare in his chest. "You put her back in play without telling me? Without any kind of coordination?" The situation evolved faster than anticipated. "We have intelligence suggesting that Operation Pale Horse wasn't what it appeared to be. New evidence has surfaced. Evidence that suggests Captain David McKenzie's death wasn't the result of enemy action." The words hit Briggs like a physical blow. Jesus Christ. Does Sarah know? We don't know what she knows. That's the problem. She's been operating independently for the past 6 months, digging, asking questions, making people nervous. We brought her back to Fort Bragg because we thought we could control the situation here, monitor her, keep her from doing something that might compromise ongoing operations. The voice paused, and Briggs could hear papers shuffling in the background. But after this morning's display, it's clear that control is no longer an option. She's made her presence known, made it impossible to pretend she's just another transfer. So we need you to do something for us, Sergeant Briggs. What? Get close to her, find out what she knows, find out what she's planning. And most importantly, find out if she's discovered the truth about her son's death. Because if she has, and if she's planning to act on that information, a lot of very important people are going to have a very serious problem. Briggs closed his eyes, feeling the weight of impossible choices pressing down on him. Sarah McKenzie had been his student once, his friend, the closest thing to a daughter he'd ever had, and he'd already betrayed her once 7 years ago when he'd been given information about Operation Pale Horse and had chosen to remain silent. Now they were asking him to betray her again. And God help him, he didn't know if he had the strength to refuse. "I'll do what I can," he said finally, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "That's all we ask, and Sergeant, be careful. Sarah McKenzie is the most dangerous person at Fort Bragg, possibly the most dangerous person in the entire military. If she's decided that someone needs to pay for her son's death, no amount of security or protocol is going to stop her." The line went dead. Briggs stood alone on the empty range, the phone still pressed to his ear, listening to nothing but static and his own ragged breathing. The morning sun had fully burned away the fog now, leaving the world sharp and clear and unforgiving. Somewhere in the administrative complex, Sarah McKenzie was having a conversation with Colonel Hayes. Somewhere in the barracks, Jake Reynolds was probably drinking himself toward the courage to face whatever guilt had been chasing him for 7 years. Somewhere in the officers' quarters, Marcus Kane was already on the phone with his father, the senator, reporting on the mysterious woman who'd made an impossible shot and disappeared like smoke. And somewhere, buried in classified files that required presidential authorization to access, was the truth about Operation Pale Horse, about what had really happened in Afghanistan 7 years ago, about how Captain David McKenzie had died and who had given the order. Thomas Briggs had spent 40 years in the military learning how to follow orders, learning when to speak up and when to stay silent, learning the difference between loyalty to the mission and loyalty to the people beside you in the fight. Now standing at the edge of 63 years old with more regrets than he cared to count, he was going to have to make a choice. Protect the institution he'd served his entire adult life, or protect the woman who'd trusted him once and might never trust him again. The crow called out again from somewhere in the pine trees. Its cry sounded like a warning. Or maybe, Briggs thought, like a promise. Something was coming. Something that had been building for 7 years. Something that had started the day a young captain named David McKenzie was killed in a desert halfway around the world. And now his mother was back, with iron in her eyes and a bullet that flew true across an impossible mile. God help them all when she pulled the trigger on whatever she was really aiming at. The morning sun climbed higher. The range sat empty and silent. And Thomas Briggs walked back toward the main complex, carrying the weight of knowledge he wished he'd never been given, heading toward a confrontation he knew was inevitable. Behind him, the target with Sarah's bullet hole dead center remained as evidence. Proof that some things, no matter how impossible they seemed, could be accomplished through sheer will and perfect calculation. The question was, what else was Sarah McKenzie planning to accomplish during her time at Fort Bragg? And how many lives would be changed or ended before she was finished? The answers, Briggs knew, would come soon enough. Sarah McKenzie had never been patient, had never been one to wait when action was possible. If she'd returned after 5 years of silence, it meant the time for waiting was over. The war, the real war, the one that had been simmering beneath the surface since her son's death, was about to begin. And Fort Bragg, with all its elite shooters and modern technology and carefully maintained protocols, had no idea what was coming. But Thomas Briggs knew. He'd seen Sarah McKenzie go to war before. And he knew with the kind of certainty that came from decades of combat experience that when the smoke finally cleared, nothing would be the same. Nothing at all. The administrative building at Fort Bragg had been built in the 1960s, all concrete and institutional efficiency, designed to withstand everything except the passage of time. The walls had absorbed decades of conversations, arguments, confessions, and lies. If concrete could remember, these walls would hold enough secrets to fill a library of classified documents. Sarah McKenzie sat in Colonel Hayes' office, her hands folded in her lap, her posture relaxed in the way of someone who had learned long ago that showing tension was showing weakness. Through the window behind Hayes' desk, she could see the training range where she'd made her statement less than an hour ago. The morning sun had fully burned away the fog now, leaving everything exposed and sharp-edged. Hayes paced behind his desk like a caged animal, his face flushed with barely controlled anger. He'd dismissed his aide and locked the door, which told Sarah everything she needed to know about how this conversation was going to go. "You went off script," he said finally, his voice tight with the kind of controlled fury that came from someone who'd been blindsided by their own people. "The arrangement was for you to arrive quietly, observe, assess, file reports. Instead, you turn the morning training session into a damn circus. Sarah said nothing. Let him vent. Let him think he was in control of this situation. Men like Hayes needed that illusion. Do you have any idea how many calls I've gotten in the past 40 minutes? Hayes continued. From division, from the Pentagon, from people whose names I'm not cleared to know. Everyone wants to know why the ghost of the legendary widow just materialized on my firing range and made a shot that's going to be all over the rumor mill by lunchtime. He stopped pacing and leaned on his desk, staring at her with eyes that held equal parts anger and something that might have been fear. So I'm asking you, Lieutenant Colonel, what the hell are you really doing here? Sarah met his gaze without blinking. I'm here to find out who killed my son. The words fell into the room like stones into still water. Hayes straightened up, his expression shifting from anger to careful neutrality. That particular mask told Sarah more than any confession could have. Your son died 7 years ago in Afghanistan, Hayes said slowly, choosing each word with visible care. Killed in action during Operation Pale Horse. It's a matter of record. There was an investigation, a funeral, a flag presentation. The case is closed, Colonel McKenzie. Sarah stood up, moving with the same economical grace she'd shown on the firing range. She walked to the window and looked out at Fort Bragg spread below her. How many young men and women training down there right now? How many of them believed they were serving something noble, something worth dying for? How many of them would end up like David, dead in the dirt with lies carved into their headstones? The case is not closed, she said quietly. The case was buried, sealed, hidden behind classifications and national security protocols. But it's not closed, not for me. She turned back to face Hayes. 3 weeks ago, I received a package, no return address, no note. Just a USB drive with 30 seconds of video on it. My son recording a message on his phone the night before he died. Would you like to know what he said, Colonel? Hayes's face had gone carefully blank. That would be classified material. If such a video exists, you should have turned it over to proper authorities immediately. Sarah smiled, a cold expression that held no humor. Proper authorities, like the ones who classified everything about Operation Pale Horse at levels requiring presidential approval, like the ones who made sure no investigation could ever dig too deep. Those proper authorities? She took a step closer to Hayes's desk. David said the operation was a lie, that he'd discovered something, that if I was watching the video, it meant they'd killed him to keep him quiet. And he told me to find Staff Sergeant Jake Reynolds, said Reynolds would know the truth. The color drained from Hayes's face. He sat down heavily in his chair, suddenly looking 10 years older. You need to be very careful, Colonel McKenzie. Whatever you think you've uncovered, there are reasons things were classified the way they were. National security reasons. If you go digging into Operation Pale Horse, you're going to kick over hornet's nests that should stay buried. Sarah leaned forward, planting her hands on his desk. My son is buried in Arlington National Cemetery under a headstone that calls him a hero. If he died because he discovered something he shouldn't have, if he was killed by his own people to protect some dirty secret, then every word on that headstone is a lie. And I'm going to find out the truth, Colonel. With or without your cooperation. With or without anyone's permission. Hayes looked at her for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice had lost its edge of command, replaced by something that sounded almost like pity. You were the best I ever saw, the best any of us ever saw. But this isn't about being the best shot or the best soldier. This is about forces you can't fight with a rifle. If you pursue this, you won't just destroy your own career. You'll put yourself in danger from people who have unlimited resources and no compunction about protecting their interests. Sarah straightened up. I've been in danger before. Not like this. Hayes shook his head slowly. In combat, you knew who the enemy was. You could see them, target them, eliminate them. But this is different. These enemies wear uniforms like ours. They sit in offices like this one. They hide behind flags and oaths and patriotism while they do things that would make our foreign enemies look noble by comparison. Then help me, Sarah said. You were a good officer once, before whatever compromises you made to get your stars. Help me find the truth about what happened to David. Hayes was quiet for a long moment. Then he reached into his desk drawer and pulled out a file folder. He set it on the desk but kept his hand on top of it. This is everything I know about Operation Pale Horse, which isn't much. Most of it was above my clearance level, even after the fact. But there are names in here. People who were involved in planning the operation. People who might know what really happened. He slid the folder across the desk. If anyone asks, I never gave this to you, and Colonel, whatever you find, whatever you do with this information, remember that you're not just putting yourself at risk. Anyone who helps you becomes a target too. Sarah took the folder. Thank you. Don't thank me. Hayes's voice was heavy with something that might have been regret. I'm probably signing my own death warrant by giving you that. But I lost a son too, 5 years ago. IED in Fallujah. And if someone had told me his death was based on lies, I'd want to know. I'd need to know. He stood up and walked to the window, his back to her. There's a secure facility about 20 miles from here. An old Cold War bunker that's still maintained for certain classified operations. If Reynolds knows anything, that's where he'll run when he realizes you're coming for him. The access codes are in that file. Sarah tucked the folder inside her jacket. Why are you helping me? Hayes was quiet for so long that Sarah thought he might not answer. Then, still facing the window, he spoke. Because 7 years ago, I was the one who signed the final report on Operation Pale Horse. I was the one who certified that Captain David McKenzie died in combat with enemy forces. I was the one who authorized the burial with full military honors. And I've spent every day since then wondering if I signed off on a murder. The admission hung in the air between them. If you find proof, if you can expose the truth, maybe I can sleep at night again. Maybe your son's death will mean something more than just another classified operation that went wrong. Sarah walked to the door, then paused with her hand on the knob. One more thing, Colonel. General Nathan Cross. The file says he was the operational commander for Pale Horse. Where is he now? Hayes turned from the window, and Sarah saw genuine alarm flash across his face. He's retired, living in Virginia somewhere. And Colonel, if Cross was involved in whatever happened to your son, you need to understand something. Nathan Cross is not a man who tolerates loose ends. If he finds out you're investigating this, he won't wait for proper channels or official responses. He'll eliminate the threat. Sarah opened the door. Let him try. She walked out of the office, leaving Hayes standing alone by his window, looking like a man who just witnessed his own execution and was simply waiting for the bullet. The barracks area of Fort Bragg was quiet at mid-morning, most of the personnel still out on training exercises or busy with administrative duties. Sarah moved through the empty corridors with purpose, her mind already 3 steps ahead, planning, calculating, preparing for what came next. She found Jake Reynolds in his quarters, sitting on his bunk with a bottle of whiskey that was already half empty despite the early hour. He looked up when she entered, and the naked fear in his eyes told her everything she needed to know before either of them spoke a word. Staff Sergeant Reynolds, she said quietly, closing the door behind her. Reynolds stood up so fast he nearly fell over, his hand moving instinctively toward his service weapon on the desk. Sarah's hand was already on her own pistol, the movement so fast and smooth it seemed like teleportation. She didn't draw, just let her hand rest on the grip, a silent message about how this could end if he made the wrong choice. Don't, she said. Please. The word please seemed to break something in him. His hand fell away from the weapon, and he sat back down heavily on the bunk, his head dropping into his hand. I knew this day would come. I've known for 7 years. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw his face. Every time I pulled a trigger, I remembered. Sarah moved into the room, her hand still on her weapon, but her posture slightly less threatening. She pulled out the desk chair and sat down, putting herself at eye level with Reynolds. Tell me what happened. All of it. The truth. Reynolds looked up at her with red-rimmed eyes. If I tell you, they'll kill me. They'll kill you anyway, Sarah said flatly. The moment they know I'm asking questions, the moment they realize the truth might come out, you become a liability. Your only chance is to tell me everything and hope I can protect you. You can't protect me from them. Reynolds laughed, a hollow sound with no humor in it. You don't even know who they are, how far up it goes. Then educate me. Reynolds reached for the whiskey bottle, took a long pull, then set it aside. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion and alcohol. Operation Pale Horse wasn't what the briefing said. We weren't going after a Taliban commander. The real target was Ahmad Shah, but not because he was funding terrorists. He was a CIA asset, had been for 3 years, feeding us intelligence on Taliban movements, helping us track high-value targets. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Then why target him? Because he got greedy, started asking for more money. threatened to expose the arrangement if we didn't pay. But more than that, he knew things, classified things about other operations, about money being moved around, about contractors getting rich off military operations while soldiers died. Reynolds stood up and walked to the window, looking out at nothing. Your son figured it out. David was smart, smarter than the rest of us. He started asking questions about why we were being sent after an asset, started digging into the intelligence reports. And he found something, communications between Ahmad Shah and someone in the Pentagon. Evidence that our operation wasn't about national security, it was about silencing a witness. Sarah's grip tightened on her pistol. Who gave the order? Reynolds turned to face her, and Sarah saw tears streaming down his face. General Nathan Cross. He was a colonel then, but he was already connected, already part of something bigger. He came to our forward operating base personally, pulled David aside. They talked for about an hour. When David came out, he looked like he'd seen the devil himself. What did Cross tell him? That he could either complete the mission as ordered and keep his mouth shut, or he could be labeled a traitor. That the evidence David had found could easily be reinterpreted as proof that David himself was the one compromised. Cross showed him fabricated emails, planted communications, a whole paper trail that would paint your son as a Taliban collaborator. Sarah felt rage building in her chest, a white-hot fury that threatened to consume everything else. And David refused. Reynolds nodded, wiping at his eyes with the back of his hand. He called you. I was there when he made the call. He said, Mom, they're asking me to kill an innocent man to cover up their crimes. What do I do? And you told him to do the right thing, to refuse the order, to trust that the truth would protect him. The words hit Sarah like bullets. She remembered that call, remembered telling David to stand firm, remembered promising him that she would fix it, that she would go through channels, that she would protect him. She'd been a fool. What happened next? Her voice came out barely above a whisper. Cross gave us new orders, said David had been compromised, said he was about to betray the mission to the enemy, ordered us to neutralize the threat. Sarah stood up slowly, her entire body trembling with controlled rage. You killed my son. Reynolds collapsed back onto his bunk, sobbing openly now. I didn't know. God help me, I didn't know. Cross showed us the fake evidence, made it look real. We believed David had turned. We believed we were protecting the unit, protecting the mission. So when Cross gave the order, when he said David was about to radio our position to the Taliban, I did what I was trained to do. He looked up at Sarah with the eyes of a damned man. I put 3 rounds in his back, watched him fall, watched him die in the dirt while Cross stood there and told us we just saved American lives. And then Cross arranged everything. The after-action report, the cover story about enemy contact, the burial with honors, all of it lies built on top of my bullets. Sarah's hand moved to her pistol grip again, her finger sliding along the outside of the holster. It would be so easy. One shot. Justice for David. An end to the man who'd pulled the trigger. But killing Reynolds wouldn't bring David back, wouldn't expose the conspiracy, wouldn't stop whoever else was involved. She forced her hand to relax. Who else knows the truth? Reynolds shook his head. Most of the team is dead now. 4 killed in action over the past 7 years. 3 died in accidents that were probably not accidents at all. I'm one of the last ones left who was actually there. And you've kept quiet all this time. What choice did I have? Reynolds' voice rose with desperate emotion. Cross made it clear what would happen if anyone talked. He has connections everywhere. People in the Pentagon, in Congress, in the intelligence agencies. He's part of something called the Shadow Committee. 5 generals who've been running black operations for their own benefit since before either of us enlisted. Sarah felt pieces clicking into place. The Shadow Committee. She'd heard rumors over the years, whispers about a cabal within the military that operated above normal chains of command. But she'd always dismissed it as conspiracy theory paranoia. Tell me everything you know about this committee. Reynolds wiped his face and took a shaky breath. Cross is the youngest member. The others are all retired now officially, but they still pull strings. They've been involved in at least a dozen operations like Pale Horse. Anytime someone gets close to exposing military corruption, contractor fraud, illegal weapons sales, they arrange an accident, a training mishap, a suicide, sometimes a combat death that's really an execution. How do you know all this? Because I've been documenting it for 7 years. Every piece of evidence I could find, every connection I could trace, every suspicious death. I knew eventually someone would come asking questions. Knew eventually the truth would matter more than my own survival. He reached under his mattress and pulled out a small hard drive, holding it out to Sarah with a trembling hand. Everything I know is on here. Names, dates, operations, financial records showing money flowing from defense contractors to offshore accounts controlled by the committee members. Communications intercepts. Witness statements from other soldiers who saw things they weren't supposed to see. Sarah took the drive. Why didn't you come forward before? Because I'm a coward. Reynolds' voice broke on the word. Because I killed your son, and I didn't have the courage to face what I'd done. Because I told myself that staying alive and collecting evidence was more important than justice. But the truth is, I was just scared. Scared of Cross. Scared of what they'd do to me. He stood up, swaying slightly from the alcohol. But you're here now, the widow herself. And if anyone can take down the Shadow Committee, if anyone can make them pay for what they've done, it's you. So I'm giving you everything. And I'm asking for one thing in return. What's that? When this is over, when you've exposed them and brought them down, turn me in. Make sure everyone knows what I did. Make sure I face a court-martial for killing Captain David McKenzie. I don't want forgiveness. I don't deserve it. I just want the truth to finally matter more than the lies. Sarah looked at the hard drive in her hand, then back at Reynolds. She saw a broken man, destroyed by guilt and fear, barely holding himself together. Part of her still wanted to put a bullet in him, but a larger part recognized that Reynolds was as much a victim of the conspiracy as David had been. A pawn sacrificed by men who saw soldiers as expendable assets rather than human beings. You're going to help me, she said. We're going to expose every single person involved in this. And then, when it's over, you'll face justice. But not before we make sure David's death means something. Reynolds nodded, fresh tears streaming down his face. There's one more thing you need to know. Cross is coming here, to Fort Bragg. He's scheduled to arrive in 3 days for an inspection tour. Sarah felt her pulse quicken. Coming here? Why? Because he knows you're here. The moment you made that shot this morning, the moment every shooter on that range saw who you were, word spread. And Cross has people everywhere. He knows you're asking questions, knows you're a threat. So he's coming personally to deal with you. How do you know this? Reynolds pulled out his phone and showed her a message. It was brief and encrypted, but the meaning was clear. The old man is coming. 3 days. Clean up all loose ends. Sarah stared at the message. Cross was coming to Fort Bragg, coming to tie up loose ends, coming to eliminate anyone who might expose the truth about Operation Pale Horse and the Shadow Committee. Coming for her. Good, she said quietly. Let him come. I've been waiting 7 years for this. Reynolds looked at her with something like awe mixed with terror. You don't understand. Cross isn't some bureaucrat hiding behind a desk. He's a stone-cold killer, trained in the same programs we were. He's personally eliminated at least 15 people who threatened to expose the committee's operations. And he's got resources we can't match. Security teams, access to surveillance, the ability to make people disappear without a trace. Sarah met his eyes with a gaze as cold and hard as winter steel. Then I guess we better make sure we get to him before he gets to us. She turned to leave, then paused at the door. One more question, Reynolds. That night in Afghanistan, when you shot David, did he say anything before he died? Reynolds closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his voice was barely audible. He said, "Tell my mother I tried to do the right thing. Tell her I love her. Tell her I'm sorry." Sarah stood motionless for a long moment, absorbing the words like body blows. Then she nodded once and walked out of the room, leaving Reynolds alone with his guilt and his whiskey and his waiting execution. The afternoon sun had turned Fort Bragg's buildings into stark geometric shapes, casting hard shadows across the ground. Sarah walked across the base with measured steps, her mind processing everything Reynolds had told her, cross-referencing it with the information in Hayes' file, building a picture of conspiracy that reached higher and deeper than she'd imagined. The Shadow Committee. 5 generals who'd spent decades building their own empire within the military structure, using classified operations to enrich themselves and their contractor allies, eliminating anyone who's got too close to the truth. And at the center of it all, Nathan Cross, the man who'd given the order to kill her son. Her phone buzzed, a text from an unknown number. The message was brief. Cemetery, 1 hour, alone, come armed. Sarah stared at the message. It could be a trap. Probably was a trap, but it was also an opportunity. Someone wanted to talk. Someone who knew she was asking questions and had information to share. She checked her service pistol, made sure she had spare magazines, and headed for the base cemetery. The Fort Bragg Cemetery sat on a hill overlooking the main complex, a solemn field of white headstones marking the resting places of soldiers who trained here and died elsewhere. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, taking position behind a maintenance building where she could observe the cemetery entrance and most of the grounds. At exactly the appointed time, a figure emerged from the tree line on the far side of the cemetery. Sarah recognized the walk immediately. Master Sergeant Thomas Briggs, moving with the careful deliberation of a man who knew he might be walking into a sniper's sights. Briggs walked to the center of the cemetery and stood there, making no attempt to conceal himself. After a minute, Sarah emerged from cover and approached, her hand near her weapon but not touching it. Tom, Sarah, they stood facing each other like gunslingers in an old western. Two people who'd once trusted each other completely and now weren't sure if that trust had survived. "You got my message," Briggs said. "Obviously. We need to talk. About what you're doing. About what you're risking." Sarah's eyes narrowed. "Are you here to warn me off? To tell me to stop asking questions about Operation Pale Horse?" Briggs shook his head slowly. "I'm here to tell you the truth. The truth I should have told you 7 years ago when I first found out. The truth that's been eating at me every single day since." He reached into his jacket, moving slowly and deliberately, and pulled out a USB drive identical to the one Reynolds had given her. "The night David died, he sent me a file. Audio recording of a conversation between Cross and the other committee members. Planning the operation. Discussing how to eliminate your son if he didn't follow orders. Laying out the cover story. All of it." Sarah felt the world tilt slightly beneath her feet. "You knew. You knew they murdered David, and you said nothing." Briggs's face was a mask of pain and regret. "They came to me the next day. Told me if I ever mentioned the recording, they'd destroy me. Destroy my family. My daughter was in college then, Sarah. My grandson was just born. They showed me pictures of them, told me exactly what would happen if I didn't cooperate. So I buried the evidence. Told myself I was protecting my family. Told myself there was nothing I could do to bring David back anyway." "You're right," Sarah said, her voice cold as ice. "You couldn't bring him back. But you could have given me the truth. You could have given me justice." "I know." Briggs's voice cracked. "I know, and I've hated myself for it every day since. When you retired, when you disappeared, I told myself maybe it was better. Maybe you'd moved on. Maybe the truth would just cause more pain. But then you came back, made that shot this morning, made it impossible for anyone to ignore you. And I realized I'd been lying to myself. The truth always matters. Justice always matters, even if it comes too late." He held out the USB drive. "This is everything. The original recording David sent me, plus 7 years of my own investigation. I've been collecting evidence the whole time, documenting the committee's operations, building a case, even though I was too much of a coward to use it." Sarah took the drive. "Why now? Why finally come forward?" "Because Cross is coming, and when he gets here, he's going to try to kill you, and probably me too, since he knows we were close. So I figured if I'm going to die anyway, I might as well die doing the right thing for once." Briggs looked out over the cemetery at the rows of white headstones marking lives cut short. "I spent 40 years in the military, fought in 4 wars, lost friends in every one, and I always told myself we were fighting for something that mattered. For freedom, for justice, for the idea that America stands for something better than the rest of the world." He turned back to Sarah. "But David died because he believed in those same ideals. Died because he refused to compromise them. And I dishonored his sacrifice by staying silent. So whatever happens next, whatever Cross tries to do, I'm with you, all the way to the end." Sarah studied his face, seeing genuine remorse there, genuine determination. Part of her wanted to stay angry, wanted to punish him for his cowardice. But a larger part recognized that Briggs was offering her something precious. An ally, a witness, someone who could corroborate her evidence and help expose the conspiracy. "All right," she said finally. "You want redemption? You want to make things right? Then here's what we're going to do." She outlined her plan in quick, efficient terms, how they'd compile all the evidence, how they'd prepare for Cross's arrival, how they'd turn his attempt to eliminate them into an opportunity to expose the entire Shadow Committee. When she finished, Briggs nodded slowly. "It's risky. About a dozen ways it could go wrong. Cross has resources we can't match. That's why we're not going to match them. Sarah's voice carried the hard certainty of someone who'd made impossible shots before. We're going to use those resources against him, make him overconfident, make him think he's in control right up until the moment we pull the trigger. Briggs smiled slightly, the first genuine expression Sarah had seen on his face since the conversation began. You sound like you did in the old days. Before David, before everything went to hell. You sound like the widow. Sarah looked out over the cemetery, her eyes tracking across the rows of headstones. So many dead, so many sacrifices. And how many of them had died for lies like David had? The widow died 7 years ago, she said quietly. When they killed my son, what came back isn't her. It's something else, something harder, something that's going to make sure David's death means something. She turned back to Briggs. 3 days until Cross arrives. That gives us 72 hours to prepare, to gather allies, to set the trap. Are you ready? Briggs straightened to attention, a gesture from decades of military service. Yes, ma'am. Ready to finish what your son started. They stood together in the cemetery as the afternoon sun began its descent toward the horizon. Two soldiers who'd survived too many wars, preparing for one final battle. A battle not for territory or resources or political advantage. A battle for truth, for justice, for the memory of a young captain who died trying to do the right thing. Somewhere in Virginia, Nathan Cross was preparing for his trip to Fort Bragg, preparing to eliminate a threat, preparing to protect the Shadow Committee and all its secrets. But Cross didn't know that the threat he was coming to eliminate had already transformed into something far more dangerous than a grieving mother seeking answers. Sarah McKenzie had become judgment itself, and judgment was coming for the Shadow Committee, coming with all the precision and inevitability of a bullet fired across an impossible mile, coming to make sure that this time finally the shot would count for something more than just another classified operation buried in classified files. This time the truth would fly true, and God help anyone standing in its path. Night fell over Fort Bragg like a shroud, transforming the familiar landscape into something alien and dangerous. Sarah McKenzie sat in her quarters, 3 USB drives laid out on the desk before her, like evidence in a trial that hadn't happened yet. Each one contained enough information to destroy careers, end lives, shake the foundations of the military establishment. Each one represented a piece of truth that powerful men had killed to keep buried. She connected the first drive to her laptop, David's drive, the one that had started everything. The video file opened with her son's face filling the screen, alive and vital and doomed. He looked so young in the recording, though he'd been 29. Old enough to have seen combat, young enough to still believe the system would protect him if he did the right thing. Mom, if you're watching this, I'm already dead. His voice carried that familiar slight accent he'd picked up during their childhood years in Texas, before the military had moved them from base to base, smoothing out regional differences until everyone sounded like they came from nowhere in particular. What they told you about how I died, it's going to be a lie. Operation Pale Horse isn't what they briefed us. We're not going after terrorists. We're going after a CIA asset who knows too much about people in the Pentagon stealing money meant for the war effort. They're sending us to kill a man to protect their corruption. And when I refuse to follow illegal orders, they're going to kill me and make it look like I died a hero. David glanced off camera, nervous, checking to make sure no one was coming. I recorded a conversation between Colonel Cross and someone at the Pentagon. It's on this drive. Names, dates, bank accounts, everything. Find Jake Reynolds. He'll know what happened. He'll tell you the truth. And Mom, I'm sorry. Sorry I won't be there to see you get justice for this. Sorry you have to be the one to finish what I started. But I know you will, because you taught me that truth matters more than comfort, that doing the right thing matters more than doing the safe thing. I love you, and I'm not afraid of what's coming, because I know you'll make it mean something. The video ended. Sarah closed the file, her hands steady despite the emotions churning inside her. 7 years she lived with the official version of David's death. 7 years of believing he'd fallen in combat against the enemy. And all that time, the real enemy had been wearing the same uniform, swearing the same oaths, hiding behind the same flag. She opened Reynolds' drive next. Files upon files of evidence. Financial records showing millions of dollars flowing from defense contractors to offshore accounts. Communications between Shadow Committee members discussing operations. after action reports that had been sanitized to remove inconvenient truths, and photographs. Dozens of photographs of soldiers who died in suspicious circumstances after getting too close to the truth. 23 names, 23 young men and women who'd believed in service and honor and died because they discovered that not everyone in uniform shared those values. The third drive, Briggs's contribution, added historical context. 7 years of methodical investigation, cross-referenced bank transactions, tracked career progressions that didn't make sense unless you understood the hidden power structure, identified the 5 members of the Shadow Committee and documented their rise through the ranks, their accumulation of influence, their transformation from soldiers into something else entirely. General Nathan Cross, General Richard Hawthorne, General Patricia Chen, General Marcus Steele, General James Tolliver. 5 names that appeared over and over in classified reports, always in the background, always connected to operations that went sideways, always protected by layers of classification and national security protocols. A knock at her door pulled Sarah from the evidence. She closed the laptop, hand moving instinctively to the pistol on her hip. "It's Santos." Sarah opened the door to find Sergeant First Class Maria Santos standing in the hallway, her face troubled. "Ma'am, we need to talk. May I come in?" Sarah stepped aside, allowing Santos to enter. The younger woman moved with the careful awareness of someone who'd learned to trust her instincts in dangerous places. She glanced at the closed laptop, the drives, the scattered documents. "You're investigating Operation Pale Horse." It wasn't a question. Sarah studied Santos, trying to determine if this was an ally or a threat. The sergeant met her gaze steadily, no deception visible in her eyes. "How did you know?" Santos pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a message. The text was brief and alarming. "Lieutenant Amy Chen found dead in her quarters. Apparent suicide. But Chen had been helping me investigate suspicious deaths at Fort Bragg over the past 5 years. 23 soldiers, all killed in accidents or combat, all had discovered evidence of contractor fraud or illegal operations." Sarah felt ice settle in her stomach. "When?" 2 hours ago. They're calling it suicide, sleeping pills and alcohol. But Chen was Buddhist, didn't drink. And she'd sent me a message this morning and saying she'd found something important about Operation Pale Horse. She was going to brief me tonight. Sarah pulled out her own phone and showed Santos the photograph of the 23 names from Reynolds's drive. Chen's name was on the list. She was already a target. They've been eliminating witnesses for years, anyone who got close to exposing the Shadow Committee. Santos looked at the photograph, her face going pale. "My God, I knew some of these people. Trained with them. Thought their deaths were just bad luck or the hazards of the job. But this is systematic elimination." Sarah closed the photo and looked directly at Santos. "Why are you telling me this? Why risk getting involved?" "Because Chen was my friend. Because I took an oath to protect and defend the Constitution, not to protect corrupt generals. And because I've been watching you since you arrived, ma'am, the way you move, the way you assess every situation. You're not here as an advisor. You're here for vengeance." "Justice," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference." "Is there?" Santos's voice carried challenge without disrespect. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like you're planning to take on the entire military establishment. That's not justice. That's a suicide mission." Sarah walked to the window, looking out at Fort Bragg's lights scattered across the darkness. "General Nathan Cross arrives tomorrow. He's coming to clean up loose ends. That means anyone connected to Operation Pale Horse. Anyone asking questions. Anyone who might expose the truth. He'll make it look like accidents, like training mishaps, like anything except what it really is. Murder to protect a conspiracy." She turned back to Santos. "So yes, I'm planning to confront him, to force the truth into the open where it can't be buried again. And yes, that might be a suicide mission. But I'd rather die trying to expose them than live knowing I let my son's murderers walk free." Santos was quiet for a long moment. Then she pulled something from her pocket, a small recording device. "Chen gave me this before she died. Said if anything happened to her, I should give it to someone who could use it. Someone brave enough to stand up to Cross." She handed the device to Sarah. "It's a recording from 3 days ago. Chen had placed bugs in Colonel Hayes' office. She captured a phone conversation between Hayes and Cross. You need to hear it." Sarah took the device and pressed play. Hayes' voice came through clearly, tense and worried. "General, I need to inform you that Lieutenant Colonel Sarah McKenzie has been asking questions about Operation Pale Horse. She knows about the classified aspects. She's been talking to Reynolds. Cross's voice was cold, controlled, the voice of a man used to making life and death decisions without emotion. Then Reynolds needs to be handled, along with McKenzie and anyone else who's been contaminated by this investigation. I'll arrive tomorrow as scheduled for the inspection. By the time I leave, Fort Bragg will be clean. Sir, with respect, McKenzie is the widow. She's not some junior officer we can simply disappear. People know she's here. Questions will be asked. Cross's laugh was devoid of humor. Let them ask. McKenzie is a grieving mother who couldn't accept her son's death, who became obsessed with conspiracy theories, who tragically took her own life while suffering from PTSD and depression. It's a story that writes itself, Colonel. One that you'll confirm when investigators start asking questions. I won't be part of murdering a fellow officer. Then you'll join her, Hayes. The only question is whether your death looks like an accident or whether your family suffers too. Choose carefully. The recording ended. Sarah felt rage burning cold and pure in her chest. Cross wasn't just planning to kill her. He was planning to destroy her reputation, to paint her son's murder as justified and her investigation as the delusions of a broken mind. We need to warn Hayes, Santos said. He's not part of this. He's being coerced. Sarah shook her head. Hayes made his choice 7 years ago when he signed off on the false report about David's death. He had chances to come clean. He chose comfort over courage. Now he's facing the consequences. So what's the plan? Sarah pulled up a file on her laptop, a schematic of Fort Bragg's layout. Cross will arrive by helicopter at 0800 tomorrow. He'll go straight to the command building for briefings. Then he'll conduct inspections of training facilities. Standard protocol, predictable. And predictable is vulnerable, Santos said, understanding dawning in her eyes. Cross expects to control the situation, expects everyone to be afraid, expects that his reputation and resources will be enough to eliminate threats without anyone daring to resist. We're going to use that confidence against him. Sarah traced routes on the schematic. I'm going to challenge him publicly, force him into a position where he can't simply make me disappear without witnesses. And while he's focused on me, you and others I trust will be copying every piece of evidence to multiple locations, sending it to journalists, to congressional oversight committees, to anyone who might act on it. That's assuming Cross doesn't just shoot you the moment he sees you. He won't. Sarah's voice carried absolute certainty, because Cross is arrogant. He thinks he's untouchable, and he'll want to gloat, want to prove he's smarter, better, more in control. That arrogance is his weakness. A second knock at the door interrupted them. Sarah's hand went to her pistol again, but Briggs's voice called out from the hallway. It's me, and I've got company. Sarah opened the door to find Briggs standing with Marcus Kane. The young captain looked uncomfortable, his usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. Captain Kane requested a meeting, Briggs said. Says he has information about Cross. Kane stepped forward, his jaw set with determination that looked newly acquired. My father called me tonight. Senator Kane. He wanted to warn me that General Cross was coming to Fort Bragg and that I should distance myself from you, ma'am. When I asked why, he let something slip. Said Cross had helped him cover up a scandal 5 years ago. Something about weapons contracts and kickbacks, and that Cross now owns him because of it. The young captain's hands clenched into fists. My whole life I thought my father was a patriot, a man of honor. Turns out he's just another politician who sold his integrity for money and power. And Cross is the one holding the receipts. Sarah studied Kane, seeing something shift in the young man's eyes. The arrogance was gone, burned away by the realization that his world wasn't what he'd thought it was. Why are you telling me this? Because Chen is dead. Because I've been reviewing the names on that list Santos showed me. Because I'm starting to understand that the military I thought I was serving doesn't exist. The real military is run by men like Cross who treat soldiers as expendable resources and treat the truth as negotiable. Kane met her eyes directly. I want to help. Whatever you're planning, whatever it takes to expose Cross and the Shadow Committee, I'm in. Briggs spoke up from behind Kane. I've been talking to some of the other instructors, people I trust, people who knew your son, Sarah. Word is spreading about Chen's death, about the questions you've been asking. People are starting to connect dots, starting to realize something's wrong. How many? Sarah asked. Enough! Briggs's voice carried grim satisfaction. Maybe 24 soldiers who are willing to stand with us when the time comes, who are sick of watching good old people die for bad reasons. Sarah looked at the three faces before her. Santos, young and idealistic, motivated by friendship and justice. Kane, privileged and talented, motivated by betrayal and the need to prove himself. Briggs, old and worn down by decades of compromise, motivated by guilt and the chance for redemption. Three allies, maybe 24 more waiting in the wings, against General Nathan Cross and the entire apparatus of the Shadow Committee. The odds were terrible. Sarah smiled for the first time since arriving at Fort Bragg. All right then, here's what we're going to do. She outlined the plan in precise detail, where everyone would be positioned, what signals to watch for, how to document everything, what to do if things went wrong, and what to do when they went right. But there's one more thing, Sarah added. We need insurance, a way to make sure the truth gets out even if Cross manages to eliminate all of us tomorrow. Kane pulled out his phone. My father may be compromised, but he's still a United States Senator. He has connections to oversight committees, to the FBI, to people who can act on evidence if it's presented properly. You think he'd help after what you just told us? Kane's expression was pained but determined. I think he's ashamed. I think he knows he made terrible choices and is looking for a way to make it right. Let me call him. Let me see if there's any integrity left in the man I used to admire. Do it, Sarah said. But be careful. If Cross has your father compromised, he might warn Cross about what we're planning. Kane nodded and stepped into the hallway to make the call. The others waited in tense silence, Santos checking and rechecking her service weapon, Briggs staring at the evidence spread across Sarah's desk as if memorizing every detail. After 10 minutes, Kane returned. His face was pale, but his eyes held something like hope. My father is making calls, reaching out to people he trusts in federal law enforcement. People who aren't part of the military chain of command, who can't be intimidated by generals or classification protocols. He says if we can keep Cross talking tomorrow, if we can get him to confess publicly, there will be federal agents standing by to take him into custody. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. Not quite hope, but something close to it. The beginning of belief that maybe, just maybe, they could actually win this. How long do we need to keep him talking? As long as possible. My father says the FBI needs time to coordinate, to get authorization, to position their people. If Cross arrives at 0800 and we can keep him engaged until 1000, they'll be ready to move. 2 hours, Briggs said quietly. 2 hours of keeping the most dangerous man in the military occupied while federal agents get into position. That's a hell of a tightrope to walk. Then we better not look down, Sarah replied. By the time she finished, dawn was beginning to paint the eastern sky with pale light. Get some rest, she told them. Tomorrow we either expose the truth or we die trying. Either way, make sure you're ready. They filed out one by one, leaving Sarah alone with her thoughts and her evidence and the memory of David's face on that video. She pulled out a photograph from her wallet, worn and creased from years of handling. David at his graduation from West Point, standing tall in his dress uniform, pride and hope shining in his eyes. Tomorrow, son, she whispered to the photograph. Tomorrow I finish what you started. The morning of Cross's arrival dawned cold and clear, the kind of November day that made every detail sharp and unforgiving. Sarah stood at the edge of the main parade ground, watching as Fort Bragg's personnel assembled for the general's inspection. Standard military protocol. Everyone in formation. Everyone at attention. Everyone pretending this was just another routine visit from a senior officer. But Sarah could see the tension in the way soldiers held themselves. Could see the extra MPS positioned at strategic points. Could see the 3 black SUVs parked near the administration building, engines running, ready for quick evacuation if needed. Cross was taking precautions. Good. That meant he was worried. And worried men made mistakes. The sound of helicopter rotors cut through the morning air. A UH-60 Blackhawk descended toward the helipad, its downdraft sending leaves and dust whirling across the parade ground. The helicopter touched down with practiced precision, and after a moment the door slid open. General Nathan Cross stepped out into the morning light. He was 58 years old but looked younger, kept fit by a rigorous training regimen and the kind of discipline that came naturally to men who'd spent their lives in uniform. His face was all hard angles and cold assessment, eyes that had seen too much death to be bothered by adding more names to the count. 4 stars gleamed on his shoulders. Ribbons covered his chest, the visible markers of a distinguished career built on a foundation of lies and murder. Colonel Hayes moved forward to greet him, saluting with parade ground precision. Cross returned the salute casually, already scanning the assembled formation with eyes that missed nothing. Those eyes found Sarah. She stood at attention with the rest of the formation, but she knew Cross recognized her immediately. Knew he saw not just a lieutenant colonel but a threat, a loose end, a problem to be solved. Cross's expression didn't change, but Sarah saw his jaw tighten slightly. Good. Let him see her. Let him know she wasn't hiding. Let him understand that this confrontation was inevitable. The inspection proceeded according to schedule. Cross moved through the formation, stopping occasionally to ask questions, to examine equipment, to demonstrate his attention to detail. All the while, Sarah could feel his awareness of her like a physical weight. They were two predators circling, both knowing that before this day ended, one of them would be dead or destroyed. After the formation inspection, Cross moved toward the administration building for scheduled briefings. Sarah waited until he was inside, then broke from formation and walked toward the building herself. Two MPS moved to intercept her, but Briggs appeared at her elbow. "The colonel is expected at the briefing," Briggs said with enough authority that the MPS hesitated. "She's the senior marksmanship advisor. General Cross requested her presence." The lie was smooth and confident. The MPs exchanged glances, uncertain, then stepped aside. Sarah and Briggs entered the building and made their way to the conference room where Cross was being briefed on training operations. They entered without knocking. Cross looked up from the briefing materials, his eyes narrowing slightly when he saw Sarah. Colonel Hayes froze mid-sentence, his face going pale. "Lieutenant Colonel McKenzie," Cross said, his voice carrying that particular military tone that could make even pleasantries sound like threats. "I don't recall requesting your presence at this briefing." Sarah closed the door behind her and Briggs. The click of the latch sounded loud in the suddenly tense room. "You didn't, General. I requested yours." She pulled out a small recording device and set it on the conference table. "I know what you did. I know about Operation Pale Horse. I know about the Shadow Committee. I know you murdered my son to protect your criminal enterprise. And I know you came here today to eliminate everyone who knows the truth." The room went absolutely silent. Hayes looked like he might faint. The two colonels who'd been conducting the briefing sat frozen, uncertain whether to stay or flee. Cross's expression didn't change, but something shifted in his eyes. A calculation being made, a decision being reached. "Colonel Hayes, clear the room. Everyone except McKenzie and Briggs." Hayes didn't move fast enough. Cross's voice cracked like a whip. "Now, Colonel." Hayes and the other officers practically ran from the room. The door closed behind them, leaving just the four of them. Cross, Sarah, Briggs, and the truth hanging in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Cross stood up slowly, moving with the controlled grace of a man who'd killed people with his bare hands and would do it again if necessary. "You've made quite a mess, Colonel McKenzie, asking questions, gathering evidence, turning people against their chain of command, all based on the conspiracy theories of a grieving mother who can't accept that her son died in combat." "David didn't die in combat." Sarah's voice was cold as winter. "He was executed by his own unit on your orders because he discovered you were using military operations to enrich yourself and your co-conspirators. That's a serious accusation." Cross circled around the table, positioning himself between Sarah and the door. "Do you have any proof or just the ravings of traumatized soldiers and forged evidence?" Sarah pulled out a USB drive. "I have David's recording of your phone conversation planning the operation. I have Reynolds' confession. I have 7 years of Briggs' investigation documenting the Shadow Committee's crimes. I have financial records showing millions in illegal payments. I have the names of 23 soldiers you've murdered to protect your secrets." She set the drive on the table, "and I have copies of all of it being sent to the Washington Post, the New York Times, and 3 congressional oversight committees as we speak." Cross stared at the drive, then at Sarah. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of grudging respect. "You've been busy, more thorough than I expected, but you've made a fundamental miscalculation, Colonel." "What's that?" "You assume that evidence matters, that the truth will somehow protect you. But evidence can be discredited. Witnesses can be eliminated. Truth can be classified at levels that make it effectively disappear. You're not fighting against one corrupt general. You're fighting against a system that's designed to protect itself. A system that will grind you down and spit you out and never admit you were right." "Then I'll die right," Sarah said, "which is more than you can say." Cross's hand moved toward his sidearm. Briggs reacted instantly, his own weapon clearing leather in a smooth motion that spoke of decades of training. "Don't, General. I've got nothing left to lose. I'll shoot you dead right here and die happy, knowing I stopped you. Cross froze, his hand hovering over his pistol. The moment stretched, three people balanced on the edge of violence, waiting to see who would break first. A knock at the door shattered the tableau. Santos's voice called out from the hallway. General Cross, you're needed at the range immediately. There's been an incident. Cross's eyes never left Sarah. What kind of incident? Captain Kane has assembled the entire marksmanship training company. Says he won't dismiss them until you address allegations of corruption in Operation Pale Horse. Sarah smiled slightly. The trap was sprung. Cross was now faced with a choice. Ignore the situation and look weak, or confront it and have his crimes aired in front of hundreds of soldiers. Cross's jaw tightened. This isn't over, McKenzie. No, Sarah agreed. It's not. But it's no longer something you can make disappear in a conference room. Now it's public. Now it's on record. Now everyone is watching. Cross straightened his uniform and walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the knob, looking back at Sarah. Your son was weak. He couldn't do what needed to be done. Couldn't make the hard choices that keep this country safe. He died because he was soft. The words were designed to hurt, to provoke a reaction. Sarah felt rage surge through her, but kept her voice level. My son died because he had integrity. Something you traded away so long ago you don't even remember what it feels like. And before this day is over, everyone is going to know the difference between a soldier and a murderer wearing stars. Cross walked out without another word. Briggs lowered his weapon, his hand shaking slightly from the adrenaline dump. That could have gone very badly. It still might, Sarah replied. Come on, we need to get to the range before Cross tries to shut this down. They emerged from the administration building to find Fort Bragg in controlled chaos. Soldiers were streaming toward the main firing range, drawn by word of mouth and text messages spreading like wildfire. By the time Sarah and Briggs reached the range, at least 300 people had assembled, far more than the marksmanship training company alone. Kane stood on a raised platform near the firing line, his voice carrying across the crowd through a portable PA system. General Cross has been accused of serious crimes, murder, corruption, abuse of authority. These are not baseless accusations. There is evidence, recordings, financial records, witness testimony, and we, the soldiers of Fort Bragg, have a right to hear the truth before it gets buried by classification and national security protocols. Cross arrived with a contingent of MPS, his face a mask of controlled fury. He strode to the platform and Kane surrendered the microphone without resistance. This is a gross violation of military protocol, Cross announced, his voice amplified across the range. Captain Kane, you are hereby relieved of command and placed under arrest for insubordination and conduct unbecoming an officer. On what grounds, General? Kane's voice carried clearly even without the microphone. For asking questions? For demanding accountability? Is that now a crime in the United States military? A murmur ran through the assembled soldiers. Sarah could see Cross calculating, trying to determine if he could still control this situation through force of authority alone. The accusations against me are false, Cross continued, based on forged evidence in the statements of mentally unstable individuals. I will not dignify this circus with a response. He turned to the MPS. Clear this area. Anyone who doesn't disperse in the next 60 seconds will be charged with failure to obey a lawful order. Sarah stepped forward onto the platform. Cross's eyes tracked her movement like a predator watching prey. General Cross, if the accusations are false, prove it. Answer questions. Provide counter evidence. Show us that Operation Pale Horse happened the way the official reports claim. Unless you can't, unless the truth is exactly what we've been saying all along. Cross's hand moved to his sidearm again, but this time he was aware of hundreds of witnesses watching his every move. You're making a mistake, Colonel McKenzie, one that will end your career and your freedom. My career ended when you murdered my son, Sarah replied. My freedom means nothing if it's based on accepting lies. So here's my challenge, General. You and me. The impossible mile. The shot that started all of this. If you make it, I'll recant everything, turn over all evidence, accept whatever judgment you decree. But if I make it and you don't, you answer every question we have, under oath, on the record, in front of all these witnesses. The crowd went absolutely silent. Sarah had just challenged a 4-star general to a shooting competition with truth as the stakes. It was insane. It was unprecedented. It was perfect. Cross stared at her, seeing the trap but unable to refuse without looking weak, without looking guilty, without admitting that he couldn't match the legendary widow in the one arena where reputation mattered most. "Fine," he said finally, his voice tight with controlled rage. "But when I win, when I prove that I'm every bit the marksman you are, you'll confess that all of this was a vendetta from a delusional woman who couldn't accept her son's death. You'll plead guilty to conspiracy, to forging evidence, to conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline. And you'll spend what's left of your life in Leavenworth wondering why you threw everything away for a lie." "Deal," Sarah said. She walked to the firing line, looking out across 1,760 yards to where the target sat waiting. The same target she'd hit on her first day back at Fort Bragg. The same impossible shot that had announced her return. The same challenge that would now determine whether truth or power would prevail. Cross took his position beside her, and Sarah could feel the weight of 300 pairs of eyes watching, waiting, wondering if justice was really possible or if, in the end, the powerful would always find a way to win. Sarah glanced at her watch. 8:45. If Kane's father had come through, if the FBI was really coordinating a response, they had 75 minutes to keep Cross here. 75 minutes to make him believe he was in control while federal agents moved into position. 75 minutes to prove that sometimes, just sometimes, the truth was stronger than power. The duel was about to begin. The morning sun climbed higher over Fort Bragg, burning away the last traces of mist and leaving the world exposed and unforgiving. 300 soldiers stood in absolute silence, creating a human amphitheater around the firing range. The air itself seemed to hold its breath, waiting for what would happen next, waiting to see if justice was real or just another story people told themselves to sleep at night. Sarah McKenzie stood at the firing line, her hands steady, her breathing controlled, her mind clear of everything except the mathematics of the impossible shot. 1,760 yards, wind gusting at 20 miles per hour from the northwest, temperature 48 degrees and rising, humidity dropping as the sun climbed, every variable a challenge, every factor working against success. Beside her, General Nathan Cross checked his rifle with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd made difficult shots in difficult places. His face showed no emotion, no concern, no awareness that his entire world might be about to collapse. But Sarah could see it in the way his jaw muscles tightened, in the slight tremor in his left hand that he quickly controlled. Cross was worried, and worried men made mistakes. Master Sergeant Briggs stepped forward to act as range master, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "Gentlemen, the rules are simple. Each shooter gets 3 attempts at the target. Best shot wins. General Cross, as senior ranking officer, you'll shoot first." Cross nodded, settling into position behind his rifle. The weapon was top of the line, every advantage that modern technology could provide. Schmidt and Bender scope, match-grade ammunition, a platform that cost more than most soldiers made in a year. The general's form was textbook perfect, breath control excellent, trigger discipline flawless. The first shot cracked across the range like a judgment. Through the spotting scope, Briggs watched the bullet impact 6 inches left of center. A miss, but not by much. Better than most soldiers could achieve under these conditions. Cross made a minor adjustment and fired again. 4 inches right of center, closer but still not a hit. The third shot was Cross's best. 2 inches low and 1 inch left. Close enough that in combat it might have been effective. But this wasn't combat. This was about precision, about proving who truly deserved to wear the title of Master Marksman. Cross stood up from the firing line, his face betraying nothing. He looked at Sarah with eyes as cold as Arctic ice. "Your turn, Colonel. Let's see if the legend of the widow is real or just another ghost story." Sarah moved to the firing line and picked up the vintage M40 that Briggs had placed there. The same rifle she'd used on her first day back at Fort Bragg. No modern optics, no computer-assisted ballistics, just iron sights and decades of accumulated knowledge about how to make metal fly true across impossible distances. She settled into position, feeling the familiar weight of the weapon, the familiar pressure of the stock against her shoulder. This shot represented everything. Justice for David, truth about Operation Pale Horse, exposure of the Shadow Committee, the future of everyone who'd stood with her against Cross and his crimes. No pressure at all. Sarah closed her eyes for a moment, letting the world fade away until there was nothing but the shot. In her mind, she saw David's face from the video, heard his voice saying he trusted her to finish what he'd started, felt the weight of 7 years of grief and rage and determination settling into her bones. She opened her eyes and began her calculations. Not with a computer or a ballistic chart, but with pure understanding built from 10,000 shots across 3 decades. Wind speed and direction, air density gradients across the distance, the subtle rotation of the earth beneath her, the thermal currents rising from the ground as the sun warmed it, variables that no scope could see, factors that no computer could predict, the difference between good and legendary. Her finger found the trigger, breath in for 4 counts, hold for 4 counts, begin the exhale while maintaining pressure. The rifle fired at the exact moment between heartbeats, the moment of absolute stillness when the body became a perfect platform. The bullet left the barrel at 2,700 feet per second, 2.5 seconds of flight time across 1,760 yards, time enough for the earth to rotate beneath it, time enough for wind to push it off course, time enough for 1,000 small factors to turn a perfect shot into a miss. The target erupted in a small explosion of paper and backing material. Dead center, absolutely perfect. The silence that followed was deeper than before. 300 soldiers stared at the target, at Sarah, at Cross, trying to process what they just witnessed. The impossible made real. The legend proven true. Cross's face had gone pale. He looked at the target, then at Sarah, then back at the target as if staring could change what had happened. Impossible, he said quietly. The conditions, the variables, nobody could calculate all of that without computer assistance. Sarah stood up from the firing line, her movements unhurried. Carlos Hathcock made this shot in Vietnam with worse conditions and older equipment. I learned from studying his methods, from understanding that technology is useful, but understanding is essential. You've spent so long relying on your rank and your resources that you forgot what it means to actually be a soldier, to master your craft, to earn respect instead of demanding it. She walked toward Cross, stopping just outside arm's reach. Now, as agreed, you answer our questions, on the record, in front of witnesses, starting with Operation Pale Horse. Cross stared at her for a long moment. Then, to everyone's shock, he started laughing. Not the nervous laughter of a defeated man, but the cold amusement of someone who still held cards nobody else could see. You actually think this matters? That making one shot changes anything? You're even more naive than your son was. He turned to address the assembled crowd. Yes, I ordered the termination of Captain David McKenzie. Yes, Operation Pale Horse was designed to eliminate a CIA asset who'd become a liability. And yes, there are 5 generals, myself included, who've been running operations outside normal channels for 15 years. Operations that have saved American lives, protected American interests, and done the hard things that soft politicians and idealistic soldiers like the McKenzies are too weak to handle. The confession sent a shockwave through the crowd. Soldiers looked at each other in disbelief. Some pulled out phones to record, to document, to ensure this moment wouldn't be erased or denied. Cross continued, his voice rising with conviction. Every one of those 23 soldiers you're so concerned about died because they discovered information that would have compromised ongoing operations, would have gotten other soldiers killed, would have damaged national security. Their deaths were regrettable but necessary, just like your son's death, Colonel. He was weak. He put his own moral certainty ahead of mission success, and that kind of weakness gets people killed. Sarah felt rage building like a tsunami inside her, but she kept her voice level. You're confessing to multiple murders, to conspiracy, to treason. You understand that everyone here is a witness, that this can't be buried or classified away? Cross smiled, and Sarah felt ice settle in her stomach. Can it? Think about who my co-conspirators are. General Hawthorne chairs the Joint Chiefs. General Chen runs Defense Intelligence. General Steele controls Special Operations Command. General Tolliver oversees all military legal proceedings. Between the 5 of us, we have authority over every aspect of the military justice system. Who exactly is going to arrest us? Who's going to prosecute? Who's going to convict? He pulled out his phone and made a call that connected on speaker. General Hawthorne, we have a situation at Fort Bragg that requires immediate attention. A voice came through the speaker, gravelly and authoritative. I'm aware, Nathan, we've been monitoring. Quite a performance. But I think it's time to end this little rebellion. Within seconds, the sound of additional helicopters filled the air. 4 Blackhawks descended on the range, and from each emerged a team of armed soldiers. Not regular military police, but special operations personnel. The kind of operators who followed orders without question and didn't leave witnesses behind. The crowd of Fort Bragg soldiers began to back away, some reaching for sidearms they weren't sure they should draw. The situation balanced on a knife edge between standoff and massacre. Sergeant Santos pushed through the crowd to stand beside Sarah. This is illegal. You can't just deploy armed forces against American soldiers on American soil. Can't we? Cross's voice carried dark amusement. Under the right emergency authorities, under the right classifications, we can do whatever we deem necessary for national security. And right now, this gathering constitutes a mutiny, an armed insurrection against lawful authority. Everything we do in response is justified and legal. Marcus Kane stepped forward as well, his face pale but determined. My father is a senator. This is being recorded and transmitted to his office right now. You kill us, you kill 300 witnesses and the entire world will know. Cross looked at Kane with something like pity. Your father is in our pocket, Captain. Has been for years. Any transmission you sent went through servers we control. Any recording you made can be edited or erased. You children think you understand how power works, but you don't. Real power isn't about who has the most votes or the best evidence. It's about who controls the narrative. And we've been controlling narratives since before you were born. Briggs moved to Sarah's other side, his service weapon drawn, but pointed at the ground. So what's the play here, General? You going to kill all of us? Claim it was a terrorist attack? A training accident? How many lies you willing to stack up? As many as necessary, Cross replied. Though I'm hoping we can resolve this with minimal bloodshed. Colonel McKenzie, here's my final offer. You surrender yourself and admit this was all a fabrication born from grief and mental illness. We'll allow everyone else to live. They'll be confined to base, debriefed extensively, and required to sign new classification agreements. But they'll live. Refuse and I'll classify this entire incident as a terrorist action by domestic extremists. Every person here becomes an enemy combatant, and we'll handle it accordingly. Sarah looked around at the faces surrounding her, Santos, young and brave, and believing justice was possible. Kane, privileged and naive, but learning the hard lessons. Briggs, old and guilty, but finally standing for something. And beyond them, 300 soldiers who'd gathered because they wanted to believe that truth mattered more than power. She couldn't let them die for her vendetta, couldn't sacrifice them all for justice that seemed increasingly impossible. All right, she said quietly, I surrender. Let them go. No. The voice came from an unexpected source. Jake Reynolds pushed through the crowd, his face streaked with tears but his voice strong. No more surrenders, no more compromises, no more letting them win because we're afraid of what they'll do. He looked at Cross with eyes that had moved beyond fear into something closer to peace. I killed David McKenzie, put 3 bullets in his back because you told me he was a traitor. I've lived with that guilt for 7 years, drunk myself to sleep every night trying to forget his face. But I'm done running, done hiding. You want to kill me for finally telling the truth? Go ahead. At least I'll die clean. Other voices joined Reynolds. Soldiers Sarah didn't know, men and women who'd watched this unfold and decided that some things were worth dying for. We're not backing down. Truth matters more than orders. You can't kill all of us and cover it up. The voices built into a chorus, 300 soldiers finding courage in collective defiance. Sarah felt something shift in the air, a change in the balance of power that had nothing to do with weapons or rank or authority. Cross's face darkened with rage. He turned to the special operations teams surrounding the range. Weapons free. Anyone who doesn't stand down in the next 10 seconds is to be considered hostile and engaged accordingly. The operators raised their rifles, selecting targets, preparing to turn Fort Bragg's main range into a killing field. Sarah calculated angles and distances with the same precision she brought to impossible shots. 12 operators, 300 potential targets. Even if she could take down Cross before the shooting started, even if Briggs and Santos and others managed to return fire effectively, dozens of soldiers would die in the crossfire. And then a new sound cut through the tension, the wail of sirens approaching from outside the base. Lots of sirens. Through the main gate poured a convoy of vehicles. FBI, North Carolina State Police, military CID. And in the lead vehicle, Sarah recognized the face she'd been hoping to see. The convoy screeched to a halt at the edge of the range, and a woman in her 50s stepped out, holding up credentials that identified her as FBI Special Agent Jennifer Hartwick, Director of the Public Corruption Unit. General Cross, you and your men need to lower your weapons immediately. This facility is now under federal jurisdiction pending investigation of multiple violations of the Uniform Code of Military Justice and federal criminal statutes. Cross turned to face this new threat, his expression calculating. You have no authority here, Agent Hartwick. This is a military matter on a military installation. Your jurisdiction doesn't extend to operations conducted under classified authorities. Actually, it does. Hartwick pulled out a document. I have a warrant signed by a federal judge authorizing the investigation and, if necessary, arrest of you and 4 other general officers on charges of conspiracy to commit murder, fraud, corruption, and violation of constitutional rights under color of law. She looked around at the special operations teams. And gentlemen, if you're thinking about following General Cross's orders to fire on American citizens, you should know that doing so would make you accessories to mass murder. No classification, no emergency authority, no chain of command protects you from that. Lower your weapons or face prosecution. The operators hesitated, looking at Cross for guidance. The general's face had gone from confident to furious to something approaching panic as he realized the trap closing around him. How did you get here? Who called you? I did. Senator William Kane stepped out of one of the FBI vehicles, his face grim. My son called me 2 hours ago, told me what was happening, told me about the recordings and evidence, and told me that if I had any decency left, I'd help stop this before more people died. He looked at Marcus with something like pride mixed with shame. I've made a lot of mistakes, compromised myself in ways I'm not proud of, but I won't be complicit in mass murder, not even to protect my own career. Cross stared at the senator with undisguised hatred. You're a dead man, Kane. You and your son both. The moment this is over, the moment you think you're safe, we'll find you. General Hawthorne's voice came through Cross's phone, still connected on speaker. Nathan, stand down. It's over. Destroy any evidence you can and prepare for extraction. We'll handle this through legal channels. Cross looked around at the FBI agents, the state police, the CID investigators all deploying around the range. He looked at the 300 soldiers standing witness to his crimes. He looked at Sarah, and in his eyes she saw the calculation of a man deciding whether to surrender or go down fighting. His hand moved toward the sidearm. Don't! Sarah's voice cut across the distance between them. You draw that weapon, you give them justification to shoot you dead. You're a monster, but you're a coward too. Prove me wrong, face trial, face judgment, face everything you've spent 15 years trying to avoid. Cross's hand hovered over his pistol for a long moment. Then slowly he raised both hands in surrender. FBI agents swarmed forward, weapons drawn, moving with practiced efficiency. They secured Cross's sidearm, placed him in restraints, began reading him his rights. The special operations teams, seeing their commander in custody and federal authority established, lowered their weapons and stepped back. Agent Hartwick walked over to Sarah, Santos, and Briggs. Colonel McKenzie, I'm going to need statements from all of you, and I'll need copies of any evidence you've collected. This is going to be the biggest military corruption case in American history. We need to make sure everything is documented properly. Sarah nodded, feeling the tension that had sustained her for days suddenly drain away, leaving her almost lightheaded. We have everything you need. 3 USB drives with recordings, documents, financial records, witness testimony from multiple sources, and now a confession in front of 300 witnesses. Hartwick smiled slightly. That confession is going to make our job a lot easier, especially since half the phones here were streaming it live to social media before we could shut it down. Cross's attempt at controlling the narrative just became impossible. She gestured toward the convoy. We'll need you to come with us for debriefing. This is going to take days, maybe weeks. And I should warn you, the other 4 generals are going to fight this with everything they have. Lawyers, political connections, classification claims. It's going to be ugly. Good, Sarah said. Let it be ugly. Let everyone see exactly what these men did and how they tried to hide it. Sunlight is the best disinfectant. As FBI agents led Cross toward a waiting vehicle, he looked back at Sarah one last time. You think you've won. You think justice prevails. But you've just made yourself a target for people far more powerful than me. The Shadow Committee is just one piece of a much larger machine, and that machine doesn't forget, doesn't forgive. You'll spend the rest of your life looking over your shoulder, wondering when we'll come for you. Sarah met his eyes without flinching. I've been looking over my shoulder since the day my son died. The difference now is I'm not alone, and neither are you. You're going to face trials surrounded by everyone you betrayed, every soldier whose trust you violated, every family whose loved ones you murdered. And when they lock you away for the rest of your life, you'll have plenty of time to think about whether it was worth it. Cross was pushed into the vehicle, the door slammed shut, and Sarah watched as it drove away carrying a four-star general toward a future of disgrace and imprisonment. The crowd of soldiers began to disperse slowly, many still processing what they'd witnessed. Some approached Sarah to shake her hand, to thank her, to tell her they were sorry about David. She accepted their condolences with quiet grace, but her mind was already moving forward, thinking about what came next. Marcus Kane approached with his father, both men looking uncomfortable but determined. "Ma'am," the younger Kane said, "I want to apologize for my arrogance when you first arrived, for not seeing the truth sooner, for being part of a system that protected men like Cross." "You couldn't have known," Sarah replied. "The system was designed to hide the truth. You're learning now. That's what matters." Senator Kane stepped forward. "Colonel McKenzie, I owe you more than an apology. I owe you a debt I can never repay. Your son died trying to expose corruption I was part of, and I stayed silent because I was afraid of losing everything I'd built. Your courage, your refusal to accept lies, it's shown me what real integrity looks like." He looked at his son, "And it's shown my son what kind of man I should have been all along." Sarah studied the senator's face, seeing genuine remorse there. "You can start repaying that debt by helping us ensure this never happens again. Use your position in Congress to push for reforms, for oversight, for accountability. Make sure the shadow committee's crimes lead to systemic change, not just individual prosecutions." "I will." The senator's voice carried the weight of a vow. "I swear it." Briggs appeared at Sarah's elbow, looking exhausted but more at peace than she'd seen him in years. "It's really over. After 7 years of carrying this weight, it's finally over." Sarah shook her head. "The criminal case is just beginning. Cross and the others will fight extradition, challenge evidence, try to classify their way out of prosecution. It could take years before justice is actually served." "But the truth is out," Briggs replied. "That's what David wanted, what he died for. The truth that can't be buried anymore." Sarah looked out across Fort Bragg at the base where her son had trained before deploying to Afghanistan. At the range where she'd made the impossible shot that set all of this in motion. At the soldiers who'd stood with her against power that seemed untouchable. "Yes," she said quietly, "the truth is out, and that's worth everything it cost." The afternoon sun had begun its descent toward the horizon by the time Sarah finished giving her initial statement to the FBI. Agent Hartwick had set up a mobile command center in one of Fort Bragg's conference rooms, and federal investigators were working through mountains of evidence that Sarah, Briggs, and Reynolds had compiled. Hartwick emerged from a side room where she'd been reviewing the recordings. "Colonel McKenzie, I've been doing this job for 23 years. Prosecuted senators, judges, corporate executives, corrupt police chiefs. I thought I'd seen the worst of what people in power could do. But this is something else entirely. The systematic elimination of whistleblowers, the use of military resources for personal enrichment, the complete perversion of everything the uniform is supposed to represent." She sat down across from Sarah, her face serious. "You need to understand something. These men, these generals, they're going to use every legal maneuver, every technicality, every connection they have to avoid accountability. They'll claim national security. They'll hide behind classification. They'll argue that civilian courts have no jurisdiction over military matters. The legal battle ahead is going to make the criminal acts look simple by comparison." Sarah leaned forward. "Then we make sure the evidence is ironclad. We anticipate every defense. We prepare for every maneuver. I didn't come this far to watch them slip away on technicalities." Hartwick smiled slightly. "That's exactly what I was hoping you'd say. Because I'm going to need you involved in this prosecution every step of the way. Not officially, of course, but as an advisor, someone who understands how these men think, how they operate, what they'll try next. I'm in." Sarah didn't hesitate. "Whatever it takes, for however long it takes." "Good." Hartwick pulled out a file. "There's one more thing you should know. We arrested General Chen 2 hours ago as she tried to board a private flight to a non-extradition country. She's already trying to cut a deal, offering to testify against the others in exchange for reduced charges." Sarah felt a cold satisfaction settle in her chest. Let her testify. Let them all turn on each other. Let the world see exactly what happens when power corrupts and institutions fail to hold the powerful accountable. A knock at the door interrupted them. Hartwick called out permission to enter, and a young FBI agent stuck his head in. "Ma'am, we just got word. The Washington Post is running the story on their front page tomorrow. Full exposure of the Shadow Committee, complete with the recordings and financial documents. It's going to be the biggest military scandal since Abu Ghraib." Hartwick nodded. "Make sure our press office is ready for the media storm. This is going to dominate news cycles for months." After the agent left, Hartwick turned back to Sarah. "You should prepare yourself too. The media is going to want to talk to you. The grieving mother who brought down corrupt generals. It's a powerful narrative." "I don't care about narratives," Sarah replied. "I care about justice for my son and the 22 others who died because they tried to do the right thing." "I know, but public opinion is going to matter when this goes to trial. When the defense tries to paint the Shadow Committee as patriots who made hard choices in defense of national security, we're going to need people to remember the truth, to remember David and the others who died trying to expose them." Sarah thought about David's face in that final video, about his voice saying he trusted her to finish what he'd started, about the promise she'd made to make his death mean something. "All right," she said. "I'll talk to the media. I'll do interviews. I'll make sure everyone knows what really happened and why it matters." Hartwick stood up and extended her hand. "Then let's get to work, Colonel. We've got generals to prosecute and a system to reform. It's going to be the fight of our lives." Sarah shook her hand, feeling the weight of commitment settle onto her shoulders. But this time, it was a weight she chose, a burden she accepted willingly, because this time she wasn't fighting alone in the shadows. She was fighting in the light, with allies and evidence and truth on her side. The evening shadows grew long across Fort Bragg as Sarah walked back to her quarters. Soldiers she passed nodded respectfully, some saluting even though she was in civilian clothes. Word had spread throughout the base about what had happened on the range, about the confession, about the arrests, about the beginning of accountability. She found Reynolds waiting outside her quarters, sitting on a bench with his head in his hands. He looked up when she approached, his eyes red from crying. "They're going to court-martial me. For killing David, Agent Hartwick said it's part of the deal. I testify against Cross and the others, but I still face justice for pulling the trigger." Sarah sat down beside him. "Good." Reynolds looked at her, surprised by the lack of anger in her voice. "I deserve worse than a court-martial. I deserve to rot in Leavenworth for the rest of my life." "Maybe," Sarah said, "but you also deserve a chance to make amends, to use what you know to help bring down the people who gave the orders. David would have wanted that. He always believed in redemption." "Did he?" Reynolds' voice broke. "Because I killed him before he could tell me that himself." Sarah pulled out her phone and showed Reynolds the video of David, the one where her son explained what was happening, what he discovered, why he was refusing orders. "Watch this. See what kind of man he was. Then decide if you want to honor his memory by drowning in guilt or by helping ensure his death leads to change." Reynolds watched the video, tears streaming down his face. When it ended, he sat in silence for a long moment. He was brave, braver than I ever was, braver than I'll ever be. "Then be brave now," Sarah said. "Face your court-martial, accept your punishment. But first, make sure every detail you know about the Shadow Committee comes out. Make sure Cross and the others can't hide behind classification or national security. Be the witness that ends this corruption for good." Reynolds nodded slowly. "I can do that. I owe him that much. I owe you that much." They sat together as darkness fell completely. Two people connected by tragedy and guilt, and the hope that maybe, just maybe, the truth would be enough to create change. Later that night, Sarah sat alone in her quarters, looking at the photograph of David she'd carried for 7 years. The image was creased and faded, but his smile was still bright, still full of the optimism she'd tried to protect and failed to save. "I did it, son," she whispered to the photograph. "I exposed them. I made them face justice. I finished what you started." But the victory felt hollow. David was still gone. 22 others were still dead. 7 years of lies couldn't be erased by one day of truth. Her phone buzzed with a text from Briggs. "News is reporting that General Steele tried to commit suicide. They got to him in time. He's under guard at Walter Reed." Sarah stared at the message. The Shadow Committee was fracturing. The generals who'd seemed untouchable were facing the reality that they might actually pay for their crimes. The machine Cross had mentioned, The larger system of corruption and power was watching one of its key components fail. And they would adapt, would protect themselves, would find new ways to operate in the shadows. This wasn't over. Not really, but it was a beginning, a crack in the armor, proof that accountability was possible if enough people were willing to fight for it. Sarah set down her phone and picked up the photograph of David again. "This is just the start," she told him. "The trial will take years. The reforms will face resistance. The system will fight to protect itself. But I'm not stopping. Not until your death means something more than just a classified operation and a flag on a coffin." She carefully placed the photograph in her wallet, next to her heart, and began preparing for tomorrow. For the media interviews and the legal battles and the long fight ahead to transform one day of justice into lasting change. Outside her window, Fort Bragg settled into nighttime routines. Soldiers on guard duty, lights burning in administrative buildings, the constant low hum of a military base that never truly slept. Somewhere in federal custody, Nathan Cross sat in a cell wondering if his lawyers could save him. Somewhere in Washington, the other Shadow Committee generals were making calls, pulling strings, preparing their defenses. Somewhere in newsrooms across America, journalists were writing stories that would dominate tomorrow's headlines. And in a small room at Fort Bragg, a 56-year-old woman who'd made an impossible shot prepared for the longer, harder battle ahead. The battle to ensure that her son's sacrifice and the sacrifices of 22 others would transform American military culture forever. The shot that had started everything had found its target. Now came the work of making sure it counted. 6 months had passed since the day Sarah McKenzie made an impossible shot and brought down a corrupt general in front of 300 witnesses. 6 months of federal investigations, grand jury testimonies, media interviews, and watching a carefully constructed conspiracy collapse under the weight of its own crimes. The story had dominated news cycles exactly as Agent Hartwick predicted, transforming from military scandal to national reckoning about power, accountability, and the price of silence. Washington, D.C. in April carried the promise of renewal, cherry blossoms painting the tidal basin in shades of pink and white, tourists flooding the National Mall to photograph monuments to men who'd supposedly valued honor above all else. Sarah stood in a small office in the Rayburn House office building, preparing for her testimony before the House Armed Services Committee. Through the window, she could see the Capitol dome gleaming in the spring sunshine, symbol of a democracy that had proven more fragile than most Americans wanted to believe. Colonel McKenzie. Senator William Kane entered the office, looking older than he had 6 months ago, the weight of public confession and ongoing investigation visible in the new lines around his eyes. "The committee is ready for you. I wanted to give you fair warning that some members are going to be hostile. Cross still has allies, people who believe the Shadow Committee's narrative about hard choices and national security." Sarah adjusted her uniform, the first time she'd worn it since that day at Fort Bragg. The medals on her chest felt heavier than usual, each one representing a mission, a moment, a piece of the life she'd built before everything changed. "Let them be hostile. I've got truth on my side, and evidence. Lots of evidence." Kane smiled slightly, an expression that held more sadness than humor. "My son is testifying this afternoon about what he witnessed at Fort Bragg, about his own initial complicity in dismissing your concerns. He's been preparing for weeks, wants to make sure he gets it right." "Marcus is a good man," Sarah said. "He learned faster than most that integrity matters more than comfort. He learned it from you." Kane's voice carried genuine respect. "You could have walked away so many times, could have accepted the official story about David's death, could have let them bury the truth along with your son. But you didn't. You kept pushing, kept fighting, even when it seemed impossible." "Because it was impossible," Sarah replied. "That's what makes it worth doing." She picked up her briefcase, filled with documents and recordings and photographs of 23 dead soldiers whose families finally knew the truth about how their children had died. 23 families who'd spent years believing military accidents and combat casualties, now faced with the reality of murder and conspiracy. Some of them had thanked her. Others had cursed her for destroying the heroic narratives they'd built around their grief. Sarah understood both reactions. Sometimes truth healed. Sometimes it just replaced one kind of pain with another. The committee room was packed with journalists, military observers, family members of the dead soldiers, and citizens who'd followed the Shadow Committee scandal with the kind of intense attention usually reserved for presidential elections or natural disasters. Sarah walked to the witness table, raised her right hand, and swore to tell the truth, as if there'd ever been any question about that. Congressman Robert Torres, chairman of the committee, a former Marine who'd served in the First Gulf War, opened the questioning. Colonel McKenzie, thank you for your service and for your courage in bringing these crimes to light. I'd like to start with a simple question. When did you first suspect that your son's death was not what the official reports claimed? Sarah took a breath, organizing her thoughts. The day I buried him, Congressman, something felt wrong about the whole thing. The witnesses who wouldn't meet my eyes. The after-action report that was too clean, too simple. The way Colonel Hayes kept apologizing for things he wouldn't specify. But I was grieving. I told myself I was looking for patterns that weren't there. Looking for someone to blame because I couldn't accept that David was just gone. She paused, letting the memory wash over her. It wasn't until I received the USB drive with David's final message that I knew for certain. And even then, part of me didn't want to believe it. Didn't want to accept that the institution I'd served for 3 decades, the institution my son died believing in, was capable of such corruption. Congressman Patricia Morrison, a representative known for her defense contractor connections, leaned forward with barely concealed hostility. Colonel, isn't it true that you suffered from severe PTSD following your son's death? That you were hospitalized for depression? That your judgment during this period was, to put it mildly, compromised? Sarah met her eyes without flinching. I was hospitalized for 3 days after David's funeral because I hadn't slept or eaten in a week and my body shut down from grief. Yes, Congresswoman, I was depressed. I just lost my only child. But my judgment was never compromised. The evidence speaks for itself. General Cross confessed in front of 300 witnesses. General Chen is cooperating with prosecutors. General Steele attempted suicide rather than face trial. These are facts, not delusions of a grieving mother. Morrison's face reddened. General Cross claims his confession was made under duress, that you threatened him and manipulated the situation to make him appear guilty. I challenged him to a shooting competition, Sarah replied calmly. He accepted. He lost. And then he voluntarily confessed to multiple murders because he was arrogant enough to believe his power would protect him even after public admission. The only thing I manipulated was his ego. The questioning continued for 2 hours. Some committee members asked genuine questions about military oversight and reform. Others used their time to defend the shadow committee or attack Sarah's credibility. Through it all, she remained calm, answering each question with precision, redirecting hostile inquiries back to the evidence, refusing to be baited into emotional responses that could be used against her. During a brief recess, Briggs found her in the hallway outside the committee room. You're doing great in there. Calm, professional, everything they're not. Sarah leaned against the wall, suddenly exhausted. How's Reynolds doing? His court-martial concluded last week. Briggs's voice was quiet. Dishonorable discharge. 5 years in military prison for involuntary manslaughter. Could have been worse. Could have been murder 1. But the judge took into account that he was following what he believed were lawful orders, and his cooperation with the investigation counted for something. Sarah felt something settle in her chest. 5 years. Reynolds would serve time for pulling the trigger, but he wouldn't spend his life in prison. There was a kind of justice in that, she supposed. Imperfect, but real. How did he take it? Better than I expected. Briggs pulled out his phone and showed Sarah a message from Reynolds. It read simply, "Thank you for giving me a chance to tell the truth. I can live with 5 years. I couldn't live with the lies anymore." Sarah nodded slowly. That's something, at least. Briggs hesitated, then showed her another news alert. General Hawthorne died this morning. Heart attack, according to his family. But given the timing, right before he was supposed to be deposed by federal prosecutors, a lot of people are questioning whether it was really natural causes. Sarah felt something cold settle in her stomach. Suicide or murder? If someone in the Shadow Committee's support network decided Hawthorne might cooperate with investigators, they might have arranged for him to die before he could talk. She looked at Briggs. How deep does this go, Tom? How many people are we really fighting? Briggs' expression was grim. Deeper than we thought. The financial investigation has uncovered connections to 3 senators, a dozen high-ranking Pentagon officials, and at least 40 defense contractors. The Shadow Committee wasn't just 5 generals. It was the visible tip of a much larger network of corruption. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of that revelation. So even if we get convictions, even if Cross and the others go to prison, The system that enabled them is still in place. Probably. Briggs's voice was quiet. But that doesn't mean this was for nothing. You've exposed the corruption, made it impossible to hide, created a roadmap for future reforms. That's more than anyone else has accomplished. The afternoon session focused on Sarah's recommendations for preventing future abuses. She outlined a comprehensive plan for independent oversight of classified operations, whistleblower protections for military personnel, and reforms to the military justice system that would prevent senior officers from bearing inconvenient truths. Some committee members took notes. Others looked bored or hostile. Sarah knew that most of her recommendations would die in subcommittee or be watered down beyond recognition. But she also knew that getting them into the congressional record mattered. Creating a baseline for what real reform looked like mattered. Making it impossible for future politicians to claim ignorance mattered. When the hearing finally concluded, Sarah stepped out of the building into warm spring evening. The crowd of reporters waiting on the steps erupted with questions, cameras flashing, microphones thrust toward her face. She'd learned over the past 6 months to navigate these moments, to stay on message, to use the media attention to keep pressure on the investigation. Colonel McKenzie, do you believe justice will be served in this case? I believe the truth is out. Whether that translates to justice depends on whether our institutions have the courage to hold powerful people accountable. We'll find out. What would you say to families of the soldiers killed by the Shadow Committee? That their children died trying to do the right thing, that their sacrifice exposed corruption that threatened the integrity of our entire military, and that we owe it to them to make sure this never happens again. Do you have any regrets about how you handled this investigation? Yes, I regret not acting sooner. I regret the 7 years my son's killers walked free. I regret every day that passed while I tried to accept lies instead of demanding truth. The questions continued until her lawyer, a sharp woman named Elizabeth Chen, who'd taken Sarah's case pro bono because she believed in it, stepped in to end the media availability. They walked together to a waiting car, leaving behind the reporters and the cameras in the circus that Sarah's life had become. You did well in there, Elizabeth said as the car pulled into D.C. traffic. Stayed calm under hostile questioning. Presented the facts clearly, made it harder for the defense to paint you as unstable or vindictive. When does Cross's trial start? Jury selection begins in 6 weeks. It's going to be the trial of the decade, maybe the century. Every major news outlet is already camping out for courtroom seats. Sarah looked out the window at the city passing by, all monuments in marble, and the machinery of democracy grinding slowly forward. Will we win? Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. The evidence is overwhelming. Cross confessed publicly. We have recordings, documents, witness testimony, but he's got the best defense team money can buy. And they're going to argue national security, classification, the stress of command. They're going to try to make this about hard choices in difficult circumstances rather than murder and corruption. So you're not sure. I'm never sure until the jury comes back. But I believe in this case. I believe in you. And I believe that sometimes, not often, but sometimes the system actually works. The car dropped Sarah at a small hotel in Arlington where she'd been staying during her time in Washington. She'd offered to stay with Briggs, who had an apartment in the area, but he'd understood her need for space, for quiet, for time alone with her thoughts. Her room was modest, clean, impersonal. She'd learned to be comfortable in spaces like this, temporary way stations between missions. The life of a soldier meant rarely putting down roots, rarely accumulating possessions that couldn't fit in a duffel bag. Even after retirement, even after everything that had happened, Sarah found herself living the same way, ready to move at a moment's notice, ready for the next fight. She pulled out her laptop and opened her email. Hundreds of messages from journalists, well-wishers, former soldiers who'd experienced their own injustices in the military system. And one that caught her eye, sender listed as anonymous, subject line blank. Sarah hesitated, then opened it. The message was brief. Colonel McKenzie, you've made powerful enemies. People who won't stop just because Cross is in custody. Watch your back. Trust no one. The machine is bigger than you know. No signature. No way to trace the sender. Sarah stared at the message for a long moment, then deleted it. She'd received dozens like it over the past 6 months. Some were probably genuine warnings. Others were attempts at intimidation. All of them reminded her that this fight was far from over. A knock at her door pulled her attention. She checked the peephole and saw Marcus Kane standing in the hallway looking nervous. She opened the door. "Captain Kane, I didn't expect to see you tonight." "Former captain, actually." Kane's smile was rueful. "I resigned my commission last month. Couldn't stay in an institution that protected men like Cross for so long. Law school starts in the fall." Sarah stepped aside to let him enter. Kane moved to the window, looking out at the lights of Arlington National Cemetery visible in the distance. "I wanted to thank you for everything, for showing me what real integrity looks like, for giving me a chance to be part of something that mattered." "You did that yourself," Sarah said. "I just gave you the opportunity. You chose to take it." Kane turned to face her. "I also wanted to tell you something. My father, he's stepping down, not running for re-election. Says he wants to spend whatever time he has left making amends, working on the reforms you outlined. He knows it won't erase what he did, but he wants to try anyway." Sarah felt something has softened in her chest. People can change, even people who've made terrible mistakes. Your father is proof of that. After Kane left, Sarah stood at the window for a long time, looking out at Arlington Cemetery where David was buried. She'd visit his grave tomorrow morning before the trial began, stand in the spring sunshine reading the new headstone that told the truth. The new stone that had replaced the old one with its carefully constructed lies. Her phone rang. "Briggs, turn on CNN." Sarah found the remote and switched on the television. The news anchor's face was grave as she reported breaking news. "We're receiving confirmation that General Patricia Chen, who had been cooperating with federal prosecutors in the Shadow Committee case, was found dead in her home this evening. Initial reports suggest suicide, but investigators are treating the death as suspicious given the timing. General Chen was scheduled to provide detailed testimony next week about financial crimes and the elimination of whistleblowers. Her death raises serious questions about witness protection in this high-profile case." Sarah felt her hands clench into fists. Another death. Another convenient elimination of someone who knew too much. Hawthorne and now Chen, both dead before they could fully cooperate with investigators. "This is a message," Briggs' voice came through the phone. "Someone is telling the remaining conspirators what happens if they cooperate." "Or warning us," Sarah replied, "showing us that they can still reach anyone, anywhere." "What do we do?" "We keep fighting, keep pushing, keep making sure the truth stays public. They can kill witnesses, but they can't kill the evidence. They can intimidate conspirators, but they can't erase the recordings and documents." Sarah, Briggs's voice was worried. "Maybe you should consider protection. Federal marshals, secure location. These people have already killed 2 generals. You're a much easier target." "I'm not hiding," Sarah said firmly. "I've spent 6 months putting my face on television, testifying in public, making myself as visible as possible. Going into hiding now would send the wrong message, would let them think fear works." "Stubborn as ever." "Determined," Sarah corrected. "There's a difference." The trial of General Nathan Cross began on a humid morning in late May. The courthouse in Alexandria, Virginia had been transformed into a fortress, federal marshals and security checkpoints creating layers of protection against potential threats. The media circus had reached fever pitch, with news outlets from around the world sending correspondents to cover what was being called the trial of the century. Sarah sat in the front row of the public gallery, flanked by Briggs on one side and Elizabeth Chen on her other. Behind her sat families of the 23 soldiers killed by the Shadow Committee. To her right, Marcus Kane sat with his father, both men wearing identical expressions of grim determination. Cross entered the courtroom in a plain suit, his 4 stars and ribbons absent, looking smaller somehow without the trappings of military authority. But his eyes were still cold, still calculating, still radiating the kind of confidence that came from a lifetime of having power and resources at his disposal. The prosecution's opening statement, delivered by Assistant U.S. Attorney Michael Torres, was devastating in its clarity. He laid out the conspiracy in simple terms: how 5 generals had used classified operations to enrich themselves and their contractor allies, how they'd eliminated whistleblowers who discovered their crimes, how they'd murdered Captain David McKenzie when he refused to participate in their corruption. Torres presented the evidence systematically: David's recording of Cross planning the operation, Reynolds' confession and documentation, the financial records showing illegal payments, the testimonies of survivors who'd watched their colleagues die in suspicious accidents, and most damning of all, Cross's own public confession captured on dozens of phones and broadcast around the world. The defense's opening statement, delivered by renowned attorney Marcus Whitfield, took a different approach. He didn't deny that Cross had given orders that resulted in deaths. Instead, he argued that everything Cross did was in service of national security, that the classified operations were authorized at the highest levels, that the soldiers who died were casualties of necessary actions in an ongoing war against terrorism and threats to American interests. It was a dangerous strategy, essentially admitting the crimes while claiming they were justified. But Whitfield was betting that at least some jurors would be swayed by appeals to patriotism and national security. The trial proceeded with methodical intensity. Witnesses testified to what they'd seen and heard. Documents were entered into evidence. Experts explained the financial schemes and how they worked. Day after day, the prosecution built its case, brick by brick, creating a structure of evidence that seemed unassailable. Jake Reynolds took the stand on the seventh day. His testimony was gut-wrenching. He described receiving orders from Cross, believing David was a traitor, pulling the trigger that ended a young captain's life, and then 7 years of guilt and drinking and knowing that he'd been manipulated into murdering a fellow soldier. The defense tried to paint Reynolds as the real villain, as a rogue operator who'd exceeded his orders. But Reynolds had documentation, written directives from Cross, recorded conversations, a paper trail that made it clear he'd been following orders, not improvising. Sarah watched Reynolds break down on the stand, watched him sob as he described David's last words, watched him accept full responsibility while also making clear who'd given the orders. It was painful to witness, but it was also powerful. The jury sat riveted, some members visibly moved. Marcus Kane testified the next day, describing what he'd witnessed at Fort Bragg. Cross's confession, the attempted massacre, the arrival of federal authorities. His testimony was crisp and credible, the kind of witness prosecutors dreamed about. When Sarah's turn came, 2 weeks into the trial, she walked to the stand feeling the weight of everything that had led to this moment. The oath, the questions, the opportunity to finally, publicly, completely tell the truth about what had happened to her son. The prosecutor led her through her testimony with practiced skill, her military career, David's upbringing, the day she received notification of his death, the years of grieving and questioning, the USB drive that changed everything, the investigation that led to Fort Bragg and the confrontation with Cross, and then the defense's cross-examination. Whitfield was aggressive, trying to paint Sarah as an obsessed mother who twisted evidence to fit her grief-driven conspiracy theories. He questioned her mental state, her motivations, her interpretation of events. Sarah remained calm through it all, answering each question with precision, refusing to be rattled or provoked. When Whitfield suggested she'd manipulated the situation at Fort Bragg to force Cross into a false confession, she looked directly at the jury. General Cross confessed because he believed he was untouchable, because he'd spent 15 years getting away with murder and corruption and thought his power would protect him even after public admission. The only thing I manipulated was his arrogance. The confession was real, the crimes were real, and the evidence proves it beyond any reasonable doubt. The trial stretched into its third week. More witnesses, more evidence, more testimony about corruption and murder and the systematic abuse of power. Through it all, Cross sat impassive, showing no emotion, giving nothing away. Finally, closing arguments. The prosecution methodically reviewed the evidence, connecting dots, showing patterns, making it impossible to claim the deaths were coincidental or the corruption was isolated. The defense appealed to patriotism, to the difficult choices commanders had to make, to the idea that sometimes the law had to bend for national security. The jury deliberated for 3 days. Sarah spent those days in her hotel room, unable to eat, barely sleeping, alternating between hope and dread. Briggs stayed with her, a quiet presence that required no conversation. On the afternoon of the third day, word came. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom was packed beyond capacity, people standing in the aisles, more watching on screens in overflow rooms. Sarah sat in her usual seat, hands clasped in her lap, forcing herself to breathe steadily. Cross stood as the jury foreman. A retired school teacher named Margaret Williams read the verdict. On the count of conspiracy to commit murder, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of murder in the first degree in the death of Captain David McKenzie, we find the defendant guilty. On the count of corruption and bribery, we find the defendant guilty. The foreman continued through 18 counts, Guilty on every single one. The courtroom erupted, people crying, embracing, shouting. The judge banged his gavel for order. Sarah sat frozen, unable to process what she just heard. After 7 years, after 6 months of investigation and testimony and fighting, guilty, justice. Briggs grabbed her hand and squeezed. She looked at him and saw tears streaming down his weathered face. "We did it." His voice was choked with emotion. David's death meant something. It changed everything. Sarah felt her own tears start to fall. She'd held them back for so long, maintained her composure through everything, refused to show weakness. But now, with the verdict read and justice finally served, the dam broke. She cried for David, for the 7 years she'd lost believing lies, for the 22 other families finally getting truth, for the system that had failed so badly but had, in the end, proven capable of accountability. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later was almost anticlimactic. Cross was given life in prison without possibility of parole to be served in a maximum security federal facility. His military pension was revoked. His honors and decorations were stripped. Everything he'd built over 40 years of service was erased, replaced by the truth of what he'd really been. As marshals led Cross from the courtroom, he looked back at Sarah one last time. Their eyes met, and Sarah saw not defeat but calculation. Cross was already planning, already thinking about appeals, already believing he might find a way out. Let him plan, Sarah thought. Let him spend the rest of his life in a cell believing he might escape. The truth was out. The evidence was established. The precedent was set. That was what mattered. 3 months after Cross's conviction, Sarah stood in the Rose Garden of the White House, surrounded by family members of the 23 soldiers killed by the Shadow Committee. President Elizabeth Hartwell, a former Army officer herself, had called this ceremony to honor the whistleblowers and establish new protections for military personnel who reported corruption. The president spoke about courage and integrity and the price of doing the right thing. She announced sweeping reforms to military justice, independent oversight of classified operations, and whistleblower protections stronger than anything currently in place. She signed the legislation into law as cameras captured the moment for history. And then she presented Sarah with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. "Lieutenant Colonel Sarah McKenzie," the president said, her voice carrying across the Rose Garden. "You refused to accept lies when truth was inconvenient. You stood against powerful people when silence was safer. You honored your son's sacrifice by ensuring it meant something more than just another classified casualty. Your courage has changed our military. Your integrity has reminded us what service really means. On behalf of a grateful nation, thank you." Sarah accepted the medal, feeling its weight settle around her neck. She looked out at the assembled crowd and saw Briggs, tears streaming down his face again. Saw Marcus Kane and his father standing together. Saw families of the fallen holding photographs of their children. And in her mind, she saw David, smiling that bright, optimistic smile from the photograph she still carried everywhere, telling her he wasn't afraid, trusting her to finish what he'd started. "We did it, son," she whispered. "Justice took 7 years, but it came. Truth took everything we had, but it won. You'd be proud." After the ceremony, as Sarah navigated the reception and the congratulations and the media attention, she felt someone tap her shoulder. She turned to find a young woman, maybe 25 years old, with David's eyes and fierce determination written across her features. "Colonel McKenzie." The woman's voice was soft but steady. "I'm Lieutenant Sarah Chen. I was named after you. My father served with your son in Afghanistan. He was one of the 43 saved during the Operation Crimson Dawn. He always told me about Captain McKenzie's courage, about your legendary skill. I joined the military because of your example, because you showed me that truth matters more than comfort, that doing the right thing matters more than doing the safe thing." Sarah felt her throat tighten with emotion. "What's your specialty, Lieutenant?" "Sniper, ma'am." Chen's smile was tentative but genuine. "Following in your footsteps, hoping to be half the shooter you are, hoping to have half the integrity." Sarah studied the young woman's face, seeing echoes of David's idealism, his belief that service meant something beyond personal advancement. "Where are you stationed?" "Fort Benning, ma'am. Advanced Marksmanship Program. I heard you might be coming there in your new position." Sarah smiled. "That's right. Director of Ethics and Integrity for Military Sniper Programs. I start next month." Chen's eyes lit up. "Then I'll have the honor of training under you?" If you're willing to work hard and learn that shooting isn't just about making the shot, it's about knowing when to shoot and when to hold fire. It's about understanding that every bullet carries responsibility. I understand that, ma'am. Chen's voice carried absolute conviction. My father made sure I understood. He told me about the men Captain McKenzie saved, about the choice your son made to refuse an illegal order even though it cost him everything. That's the kind of soldier I want to be. Sarah felt something shift in her chest. The weight she'd been carrying for 7 years, the burden of David's death, seemed somehow lighter. Not gone, never gone, but shared now with a new generation that understood what his sacrifice meant. Then let me buy you a coffee, Lieutenant. I want to hear about your father, about what he remembered from that day. And I want to tell you about David, not the sanitized version from official reports. The real person, the son I lost, the soldier whose integrity you're honoring by following this path. They slipped away from the reception together, two soldiers separated by age and rank, but connected by a legacy of courage and sacrifice. They found a quiet cafe near the White House, sat at a corner table, and talked for 3 hours. Chen told stories her father had shared, about the desperate defense in that valley, about David's calm leadership under fire, about Sarah's shots that had seemed impossible, that had saved lives when all hope seemed lost. Sarah told stories about David as a child, about teaching him to shoot when he was 10 years old, about his first deer hunt, about the day he got his acceptance letter to West Point and how proud she'd been, about the last phone call when he'd asked her what to do about the illegal orders and how she'd told him to trust that doing the right thing would protect him. I was wrong, Sarah said quietly. Doing the right thing didn't protect him. It got him killed. No, ma'am. Chen's voice was firm. With respect, doing the right thing is what made him a hero. What made his death mean something. My father tells me that Captain McKenzie saved his life twice. Once with his leadership in that valley, and once by refusing to participate in corruption, by forcing the truth into the open even though it cost him everything. That second act of courage saved more lives than any shot ever could. Sarah felt tears threatening again and forced them back. You have his heart, you know. David's heart, that same belief that service means something, that integrity matters. Don't lose that, Lieutenant. The military needs people like you, needs people who understand that following orders isn't the same as doing right. I won't lose it, ma'am. I promise. Chen pulled out her phone and showed Sarah a photograph. It was a military portrait of a young captain in dress blues, medals on his chest, pride in his eyes. David McKenzie, frozen in time, forever 29, forever believing the system would protect those who served it honestly. I keep this on my phone, Chen said, as a reminder. When I'm faced with a choice between what's easy and what's right, I look at this picture and ask myself what Captain McKenzie would do. Sarah stared at the photograph, her son's face smiling back at her across 7 years of grief and fighting, and finally justice. Keep that picture, she said, and when you report to Fort Benning next month, find me. I'm going to personally oversee your advanced training. I'm going to teach you everything I know, not just about shooting, but about being the kind of soldier David believed in, the kind who understands that the true measure of a warrior isn't how many enemies they kill, but how many lives they save. Chen stood and saluted, crisp and formal despite the civilian setting. Thank you, ma'am. I won't let you down. I won't let Captain McKenzie's memory down. Sarah returned the salute. I know you won't, Lieutenant. I can see it in your eyes. You're going to be exactly what the military needs, what the country needs. Living proof that David's sacrifice changed something, that it mattered. After Chen left, Sarah sat alone in the cafe for a long time, watching the city move past the window. The sun was setting, painting the monuments in golden light, transforming Washington from a place of power and corruption into something almost beautiful. Her phone buzzed. A text from Elizabeth Chen. Appeals court rejected Cross's first motion. Case proceeding to next phase. Could take years, but we're confident. Justice is slow, but it's moving forward. Sarah typed back a response. Keep fighting. I'll be there for every hearing, every motion, every step. We didn't come this far to let him slip away on technicalities. She put her phone away and looked out over the city one last time before heading back to her hotel. Tomorrow she'd fly back to Fort Bragg to begin transitioning to her new role. Tomorrow the work of reform would continue. Tomorrow she'd start training the next generation of soldiers who understood that integrity mattered more than orders. But tonight she could rest. Could sleep knowing that justice, slow and imperfect as it was, had finally been served. Could dream knowing that David's sacrifice had meant something more than just another classified operation buried in classified files. She walked back to her hotel through the warm spring evening, the Medal of Freedom heavy around her neck, but her steps lighter than they'd been in 7 years. The city lights came on around her, monuments glowing against the darkening sky, bearing witness to the messy, painful, essential work of holding power accountable. That night, Sarah slept peacefully for the first time since David died. No nightmares about the phone call telling her he was gone. No dreams about what she could have done differently. No guilt about the 7 years it took to find justice. Just peace. Hard-won, dearly bought, but real. The next morning, Sarah visited Arlington one last time before leaving Washington. She found David's grave in the early light, the new headstone gleaming white and honest in the sun. The Presidential Medal of Freedom she'd received yesterday sat in her pocket. She pulled it out, opened the case, and placed it on the grave marker. "This belongs to you more than me," she said quietly. "You're the one who started this, who refused to compromise, who chose honor over safety. I just finished what you began." A voice behind her made her turn. Lieutenant Sarah Chen stood a respectful distance away, in dress uniform, holding a single white rose. "I hope I'm not intruding, ma'am. I wanted to pay my respects, to thank Captain McKenzie, to promise him that his example won't be forgotten." Sarah gestured her forward. Chen knelt beside the grave, placed the rose carefully, and bowed her head for a moment of silence. When she stood, Sarah put a hand on her shoulder. "He would have liked you, Lieutenant. Would have been proud to serve alongside you." "I hope so, ma'am. I'm going to spend my career trying to be worthy of that." They stood together in the quiet morning, two soldiers honoring a fallen warrior who'd chosen integrity over survival. Around them, thousands of white headstones stretched in perfect rows, each one marking a life given in service. Some had died in combat, some had died for lies. But David McKenzie's stone now told the truth, and that truth would echo forward through generations of soldiers who understood that the hardest battles weren't always fought with weapons. Sometimes the hardest battle was simply refusing to lie. Sarah and Chen walked out of Arlington together as the sun climbed higher. They didn't talk much, didn't need to. The understanding between them ran deeper than words, a connection forged by shared values and the legacy of a man who died trying to do right. At the cemetery gates, they parted ways. Chen saluted one final time. "See you at Fort Benning, ma'am. I'll be ready." "I know you will be," Sarah replied. "And Lieutenant, remember this feeling, this certainty that you're doing something that matters. Hold on to it when things get hard, when following orders conflicts with doing right. That certainty is what David died protecting, what I'm going to teach you to defend." Chen nodded, her young face serious and determined. "I won't forget, ma'am. I promise." Sarah watched her walk away, this young woman named in her honor, carrying David's legacy forward into an uncertain future. The military would face new challenges, new corruptions, new tests of integrity. But now there was a precedent, a roadmap, living proof that accountability was possible. The machine was still there, still operating in shadows, still protecting the powerful. Chen's death and Hawthorne's death proved that. But the machine had been wounded, exposed, forced to acknowledge that sometimes, just sometimes, truth could win. Sarah headed to the airport, ready to begin the next chapter. Fort Benning, training the next generation, building systems that would prevent future David McKenzies from dying for doing right. It wasn't the ending she'd wanted 7 years ago. She'd wanted her son alive, wanted the system to work the first time, wanted justice without having to fight for every inch of it. But it was the ending they'd earned. Sarah and David and Briggs and Reynolds and Kane and all the others who'd chosen truth over comfort. And in the end, that would have to be enough. As her plane lifted off from Reagan National, Sarah looked down at Washington one last time. The city spread below her, center of power and corruption and democracy's messy promise. The monuments gleamed white in the morning sun. The Capitol dome shone like a beacon. And somewhere in a federal prison, Nathan Cross was beginning his first full day of life in a cell, his power stripped away, his crimes acknowledged, his legacy destroyed. Justice, finally, after 7 impossible years, after one impossible shot that had started everything, after a mother's impossible determination to honor her son by refusing to accept lies. Sarah closed her eyes and whispered one final time to David, "Rest easy, son. Your death changed everything. Justice took 7 years, but it came. Truth cost everything, but it won. And tomorrow I start making sure no other mother has to fight the way I fought. No other soldier has to die the way you died. Your legacy will be a military that finally, truly values honor over convenience. The plane climbed into the clouds, carrying Sarah toward her next mission, her next battle, her next chance to prove that David Mackenzie's sacrifice had meant something that would echo through generations. The stars would come out tonight over Fort Benning, same stars that had watched over David in Afghanistan, same stars that had seen Sarah make impossible shots in impossible places. Constant, unchanging, bearing witness to all of it. And under those stars, a new generation would train, would learn, would carry forward the understanding that sometimes the most important shot wasn't the one you took, but the one you refused to take. That sometimes the greatest act of courage was simply standing up and telling the truth, no matter the cost. Lieutenant Sarah Chen would be part of that generation, and behind her, others would follow. Soldiers who understood that integrity wasn't negotiable, that orders weren't the same as righteousness, that service meant protecting the values you swore to defend, even when protecting those values put you at odds with the people giving orders. The impossible had become possible. The widow had found redemption. The truth had won against power. And somewhere in Arlington, on a white headstone under an open sky, a medal of freedom caught the sunlight and gleamed like a promise. Like justice finally served. Like a legacy finally secured. Like one impossible shot, perfectly placed, changing everything forever. The end. Thank you for joining me on Sarah's 7-year journey for justice. As a storyteller, I'm deeply honored to share stories about men and women who served with honor and refused to let truth be buried. This tale of a mother's courage in an impossible shot reminds us that integrity still matters, even when the cost is everything. I'm curious, have you ever faced a moment where doing the right thing meant standing alone? What would you have done in Master Sergeant Briggs's position? Your thoughts and experiences in the comments mean the world to me. If this story resonated with you, please subscribe so we can continue honoring those who serve. Part 2 explores the trial. You won't want to miss it. Semper Fi to all who served.